successful at these international hairstyling competitions, and he was able to parlay that success into a corporate job at Wella, which was subsequently, as you'll hear, bought out by Coty, and then P&G, Procter & Gamble, which I'm sure you've all heard of. You have not heard of Coty or Wella. I expect some of the women here have if you've ever used OPI or any of those type of products, Sebastian Hair Care. As part of his job at Wella, Fabio had to move his family to the United States, and so therefore he had to leave behind his large extended family, and they moved to the LA area approximately 7 years before his murder. He was the first to be able to bridge the gap between hairdressers and the corporate world, which was extremely remarkable, as you hear. He went from being a famous Canadian hairstylist and platform artist to being hired as an executive vice president of education in a worldwide $4 billion company. He made a substantial salary as an executive, by most people's standards, I would suspect, by all of us. He traveled the country and he traveled the world, making connections and growing Wella's hair care product business with his large team, and you're going to hear from a lot of those people. Fabio created, based on his charisma, a very wide circle of friends in Los Angeles. He also had a wide circle of friends in Canada, mostly people associated with the beauty industry. You're going to hear that he and his wife, the defendant, socialized often. They entertained at their home. They hosted holiday parties and summer pool parties and barbecues and things of that nature, as you see here. Fabio's success led to valuable privileges for his family. There were massive changes in lifestyle, where he went from being a hairdresser and a platform artist to a corporate job as a consequence of his personal efforts. His executive position, as you could imagine, came with many benefits for him and his family's future, such as life insurance, stock options, retirement accounts, health insurance, and various other benefits. And naturally, his wife and his children reaped the benefits because, as we all know, that's what a family and a marriage is supposed to be all about. The Sementillis bought a large, beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley, which you see here. This was actually the second home they bought in the San Fernando Valley. The family lived here on Queen Victoria Road in Woodland Hills for approximately 4 years prior to his death. They appeared to have a great life, the kind that most people would dream of. When not working or traveling for business, Bob would always sit on the back patio. You can see on the bottom right, there is a covered area. He would sit in that back area to relax. He had a TV out there. He had a fire pit. He worked out there. He held meetings out there. He posted to his professional social media posts to the industry out there. He would sit back there and he would relax. And one thing that Fabio loved to do when he sat back there, whether he was taking meetings or working, was he would love to sit back there and smoke cigars. And this is where he eventually was murdered. In February of 2017, he was going to celebrate his 20th wedding anniversary to the woman that he referred to as his queen. He often called her Pootsie. He talked about her all the time, and their date nights to his friends and colleagues. He often would try to sneak out of the office early on times when he was not traveling on business so he could take her out to dinner. And he constantly called her during the day to check in with her, also when he was traveling for work. His 50th birthday was coming up. It was on the horizon, and he bought himself his dream car, a used Porsche Turbo. He was planning on driving the car up to Pebble Beach to play golf with a group of his close buddies for a weekend to celebrate. But he didn't get to do that. He was enjoying his life, and he enjoying the fruits of his hard labor. However, as you're going to hear, none of this was enough for his wife, the defendant. You're going to hear that the defendant led a privileged life. She had an adoring husband who was a superstar in the beauty industry, a very unusual man. She didn't have to work. She previously had a few part-time jobs when they moved to the California area, but she handled the family's finances. She handled the family's schedules. As I said, they had 2 teenage daughters, and she had privileges that many of us don't have. She had a housekeeper. She had a guy who cleaned the pool. They had gardeners, and she seemed to enjoy spending her days cooking elaborate Italian meals, raising their teenage daughters, lunching with her friends, and doing pretty much whatever she wanted. She also enjoyed many of the benefits of Fabio's success. They went on expensive vacations to exotic locations that you're going to hear about, such as Hawaii, Cabo, or St. Thomas, as you see here. Many of these were prepaid trips by the company that were awarded to Fabio and his team because of their success and their hard work. You're going to hear through various people that are going to testify from the beauty industry that these were called trendsetter trips, and that Fabio's team was awarded these high-value vacations pretty much every year. You're also going to see that the defendant is someone who is very concerned about appearances. As a result, she regularly posted about her fantastic life on her public social media account, her Instagram account, which she kept under her name, Monica Sementilli, and that she would include numerous photographs of herself and her family, as you see here. As I mentioned, she and Fabio had 2 lovely daughters, Jessica, who was 18 at the time of her father's murder, and Isabella, or as they referred to her as Bella, who was almost 17 and still in high school. While the defendant posted on her social media account about the fulfilling, happy life she had with her family, behind the scenes, she was becoming more and more dissatisfied with her comfortable, privileged life. Sometime in 2015, or maybe even before, you're going to hear the defendant became bored with her life, and she was looking for excitement. She wanted a new life, and she began to create one through joining a racquetball league at LA Fitness in Canoga Park, which is in the Woodland Hills area. You're going to hear that she joined the gym in 2015. She hired Matt Nurse. You see his photograph here on the left as a personal trainer to try and get in shape. And you're going to see on the right that she downloaded pictures from his social media account to her Hotmail account, one of which, like I said, you can see here on the far right, a photograph that Matt had posted on his own account of his abs. Sometime in approximately maybe June of 2015, the defendant began flirting with Matt Nurse, her trainer. She invited him to go out for drinks. You're going to hear they eventually went out for lunch in the Calabasas area. And you're going to hear that the defendant propositioned him for sex. However, he wasn't interested and he turned her down. She confided in him at that time. She was unhappy in her marriage. He asked her, why don't you just get a divorce if you're so unhappy? And she said, why throw away 20 years? Because, of course, her marriage brought all these great privileges. And Fabio was off and away traveling on business, which was a major part of his job at Wella and Cody. And so this allowed her a lot of free time to do as she pleased most of the time. Through the racquetball league at LA Fitness, the defendant made some new friends, including Ricardo Cabrera and Sheila Salahian, who you're going to hear from, and you'll hear more about today. You're also going to see the defendant here in these photographs at the LA Fitness in the racquetball area with her friends Elise Bluel and Faye Manucheri-Kubian behind them. Seated to their left in the bottom right photograph, Sheila's in the yellow tank top and Ricardo in the lavender-colored shirt on the bench. You're also going to hear that the racquetball league coordinator at LA Fitness was a guy named Robert Baker. The defendant, her friend Elise, and Faye were friends at the gym, but they also socialized outside of the racquetball league. They referred to themselves as the Three Musketeers, and both Elise and Faye thought that they were close friends of Monica's. Defendant mentioned to them that she was tired of being a housewife to her friends, and she also confided in them that she wanted to hook up with her trainer, Matt Nurse, which I told you about. Sometime in September of 2016, you'll hear the defendant invited these ladies over to the house along with Robert Baker while Fabio was away on business. What you'll hear is by this time, September of 2016, the defendant was already engaged in a torrid affair with Robert Baker, the racquetball league coordinator, which she never told her friends about. They thought they knew her. You're going to hear from an awful lot of people over the course of the next 6 to 8 weeks, perhaps, that are going to tell you they really thought they knew who the defendant was, and they did not. She betrayed them, just like she did with her family and her friends. This here on the left, you can see is a photograph of Robert Baker with Sean McCullum at LA Fitness. Sean McCullum was another member of the league, and you're going to hear about him and his wife. Paula, in the background, you can see the defendant in black with red shoes talking on her cell phone. On the right is another picture of Robert Baker, the defendant's lover and co-conspirator in this case. In December of 2015, the defendant began to take racquetball lessons from Baker. They exchanged emails December 1st, which you see here. This is approximately when they first met. And you can see the exchange where the defendant says, "Hi, it's Monica. I know you said league starts in January. Can I get lessons? Let me know if you're available. What are the right rates?" And she flirts with him a little bit, looking forward to kicking my trainer's butt. LOL, Monica Sementilli. And the defendant says he's available for lessons anytime, and he sends her his cell phone number. This is a cell phone number you're going to hear about over and over again. You may want to jot it down. 213-272-1093. It wasn't long after this email exchange before the defendant and Robert Baker were sexually involved. Their affair began very soon after these communications. The defendant obviously believed Baker was exciting, although he had no money, no prospects for success. And you're going to hear that at this point, the defendant began living two lives, two very separate lives simultaneously. Eventually, the defendant, she decided she would rather live the more exciting new life with Baker that she was creating, which was completely different than her role as a wife and mother. So who is Robert Baker? And you've heard about him during jury selection. As I said, he was the racquetball coach and coordinator at LA Fitness. Years ago, he was in the Army. You're going to hear from 2015 to 2017, he lived in an apartment in Woodland Hills with another man. This was located at 6817 Independence Avenue, apartment 110 in Canoga Park. You're going to hear a lot about that location. That location was approximately 4 miles from the Sementilli home on Queen Victoria. You're also going to hear that Robert Baker was a registered sex offender, and that this stemmed from a series of 1993 convictions for lewd and lascivious acts with a child under 14. You can see here I've listed the counts: unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor, continuing sexual intercourse with a child, oral copulation and sodomy. You're going to learn that the victim in this case was actually his stepdaughter from a prior marriage. In every way, Robert Baker was the opposite of Fabio. Fabio, on the other hand, was everything Robert Baker is not. Fabio was a devoted husband and father. He was beloved, as I mentioned. He was charismatic, successful, highly intelligent, very kind, charming, and above all, honest. And he wanted the best for his family and friends. You're going to hear that on July 7th of 2023, the defendant's co-conspirator in this case, who she was indicted with, Robert Baker, pled no contest to the same charges and the special circumstance allegations that the defendant is facing in this case. He pled to the first-degree murder of Fabio Sementilli. He admitted the personal use of a knife, along with two special circumstances which the defendant also faces, that being murder for financial gain and murder by means of lying in wait, which I will describe for you probably during closing after the judge has read the jury instructions, or before, depending on how that works out. He also pled no contest to conspiracy to commit murder of Fabio. You're going to hear that he wasn't offered ever any deals. He pled open to the court. He pled no contest. You'll hear that's treated the same as a guilty plea. And the Honorable Judge Cohen here sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. You're going to hear that Baker subsequently met numerous times with the defendant's attorney, as well as her investigator, without his own attorney present. You're going to hear that he provided at least...
Objection, Your Honor. That's objectionable based on the court's prior rulings and orders in this case.
It's overruled.
Again, you're going to hear that he met numerous times with the defendant's attorney and investigators without his attorney present, that he provided at least a dozen different versions of what happened with respect to the murder of Fabio Sementilli. You're going to hear that every time they interviewed him, he changed his story, that he started out with what I'll call and ridiculous is putting it lightly, a ridiculous, I'll call it the confession letter, where he actually blamed Fabio for his own death. And he framed it in terms of an apology letter to the defendant. You'll see that. Next time they interviewed him, he told a completely different account about the murder, indicating he did this murder so he could have the defendant all to himself. You're going to hear that in the initial apology letter version, he admitted he met up with the defendant at the local Target in Woodland Hills just prior to committing the version. As I said, his story continued to change, so in his next version, he denied they ever met at Target. In yet another version, he said the fact that they both happened to be at Target just before the murder was just a coincidence, that they were both there at the same time. You're going to hear that he alleged he thought for 7 years while he was in custody with the defendant that he'd be acquitted, but suddenly he had an epiphany, realized he was going to be convicted, and so he came into court and pled to the charges. You're going to hear that he told the defendant's attorney and investigator that he committed the murder with a guy by the name of Jaybird. When they interviewed him again and told him that another co-conspirator in this case, Christopher Austin, had been arrested, Baker changed his story, admitted he had lied about this individual Jaybird, that that was a name he had made up, as if that was something we couldn't have figured out for ourselves, and that he did bring Austin along as an extra set of eyes, he said, and had made up this person Jaybird. He told the defense attorneys that he was just trying to protect young Christopher Austin, and you're going to hear that's just as he's going to try to do here at trial with respect to the defendant. When Baker was interviewed yet again and told what Austin had said in interviews with law enforcement and the district attorney's office, you'll hear he changed his story yet again. In fact, every time they interviewed him and every time they told him more and more information, more and more evidence in the case, he would change his story to fit the evidence, to try and explain it away. And you'll hear that every time they went to interview him, he asked to see photos, to hear recordings, once again, so that he could manufacture testimony when he comes into this court to be able to explain away the evidence. And despite the fact that they interviewed him multiple times and that he lied repeatedly, He continually told the defense attorney and the investigator that he was telling the truth, yet he continued to lie over and over again. But the defense is going to tell you that he is a credible witness. In fact, he's going to be their star witness in this case. You're going to hear that he mentioned multiple times in recorded courthouse lockup conversations that he had with the defendant. And when I say recorded courthouse lockup conversations, I'm talking beyond this door right here. 2 of the dates occurred in Van Nuys at the very beginning before the case was transferred downtown to this court. And the other 4 occurred in the lockup, right behind this door. And you're going to hear that that area has recording devices. It also has cameras. And you're going to hear some of those recordings. They're hours and hours and hours long. And you're going to hear several hours, but you're not going to hear all of it. You're going to hear snippets, clips, portions. You're going to hear that the defendant mentioned multiple times in these lockup recordings, in her conversations with Baker, that Baker said he was going to lie, that he's going to testify for her, that she was not involved, and he's going to take the blame if it becomes necessary. And you're going to hear that recording. And you're also going to hear them plotting as they sat for hours every time they were brought out from their local jails to attend the court appearances over the years that their case wound its way through the system in this courthouse, in this lockup, in this courtroom. And I also want you to keep in mind, when I told you that Robert Baker was sentenced by Judge Cohen to life without parole, that means he faces 0 consequences if he gets up on the stand and lies, right? Because what do you do with a guy who you've already sentenced to life without parole? No consequences. By falsely testifying that the defendant had nothing to do with the murder of her husband, if he convinces you to find her not guilty, she gets to collect Fabio's life insurance proceeds. And you're going to hear about that. For over a year, the defendant and Baker had been having an intense sexual affair. Not just your typical affair, but they became obsessed with each other. They believed they were soulmates. You're going to see some writings indicating this. You're going to hear some recordings indicating this. And that they were destined to be together. You're going to hear that the defendant is a compulsive liar, just like Robert Baker, as she tried to maintain these completely different, these 2 separate lives. One with her family that included Fabio and her daughters, and the more exciting one that she was creating with Baker every time Fabio was at work or was traveling out of town on business. And you're going to learn that she enjoyed the risk of living this double life. Photograph on the right is obviously a photograph of them out at a restaurant. The photograph on the left, if you've ever FaceTimed anybody, you can see Baker, it looks like he's not wearing a shirt, and they are FaceTiming one another and recording it. You're also going to hear that the defendant sent over 300 videos and photographs, which included hundreds of naked photos of herself to Baker during the course of their affair. And while you're not going to see that evidence, because of its salacious or obscene nature that can't be brought into court, you're going to hear a detailed description of that evidence from various LAPD detectives who investigated this case over the years, including retired detective Mitzi Roberts. These photos and videos were recovered after their arrest from the defendant's iCloud account. I don't know how many of you have an iPhone, but if you do, you're probably aware that you can set up an iCloud account, and that your iCloud account mess up what you have on your phone. Some of these photos were, as I said, found on Baker's backup. He had a Dropbox because, as I told you, the defendant, when she took these naked selfies of herself, she sent them to Baker and he stored them on his Dropbox, also on SD cards that you can use in a phone or a camera. It's an external hard drive of types. And you're going to hear that this evidence demonstrates the defendant's private life with Robert Baker versus the public image that she was projecting regarding her life with Fabio and her family. Not only was the defendant having an affair with Baker, but they were also swinging with other people. Some of you might be too young to remember what that word even means. But they were swinging with other people, meaning that they were having sex with other individuals as groups or three-ways, that the defendant was having sex with other men while Baker watched, sometimes over Skype, and that a lot of those photographs were also found in her iCloud account or in Baker's Dropbox, or both. You're going to hear they used a specific website for this lifestyle lounge, an explicit swinger website, in order to communicate with third parties and set up dates for group sex. You're going to hear that lifestyle lounge allows individuals and couples to register social style accounts in order to meet one another across the country. You're going to hear that over 1,500 log entries were found on the defendant's iPhone web history between July 2nd of 2016 and July 13th, 2017 for this particular website. You're also going to hear that additional entries were found on her tablet. You're going to hear she had an LG tablet. You heard in the indictment about the amount of communications. This is a chart that sort of lays some of this out for you. Again, these are phone numbers you're going to want to jot down and be familiar with because it tells you the communications between the defendant's iPhone mobile number, 818-424-4213, and Baker's cell phone number. And I already told you about that number, 213-272-1093. These are communications that took place between December of 2015 and their date of arrest, June 14th of 2017. You're going to learn that initially the defendant used her iPhone mobile number to communicate with Baker's Samsung Android mobile phone, and subsequently they started using encrypted applications and burner phones in order to communicate. Their burner phones were never found as they dumped them before their arrest, and you're going to hear some of their jail recorded lockup overhears talking about their destruction of evidence.
So for any time in the next 10 minutes that you find that it's available for a break, let me know.
Very good, Your Honor. Let me just finish this
Go
one
ahead.
chart. This chart gives you a rough idea of the sheer volume of communications between the defendant and her lover, co-conspirator Robert Baker, as I said, during this period. And you can see the amount of communications, the amount of text messages versus the amount of calls. It also gives you percentages. So that means when you're talking about 49.8% of Sementilli's cellular communications were with Baker, that means almost half of all of her communications on her phone were not with her husband, not with her children, not with her friends. They were with one individual, that being the defendant, her co-defendant, previous co-defendant, in this case, Robert Baker.
Good time?
Yes.
Let's take our morning recess for 15 minutes. The admission applies. We'll be back for 15 minutes.
They used Viber, they used WhatsApp, and they also used unregistered burner phones. Although we'll never know exactly when, sometime prior to January of 2017, the defendant and Robert Baker came up with a plan to murder Fabio, and that is a conspiracy. When two people agree to something, and share the same intent and intend to carry out the crime. And one of them, as you heard during jury selection, at least one co-conspirator commits an overt act. I think the judge read to you approximately 56 of them. The conspiracy is complete. You're going to hear that you don't have to have a formal agreement. A conspiracy isn't where you sit down and write it up. It can be inferred from the facts and from the conduct of the parties. You're going to hear that due to the use of these encrypted apps, forensic experts can't access the content of their communications as if they could on a regular text. So we don't have that. Only the sender and the recipient can read the messages. The sent messages are scrambled into an unreadable code, which therefore means it's been encrypted. And there's no way for those encrypted messages, those communications to be intercepted and read. And even the app companies themselves tell you that they themselves can't unscramble the messages. These conversations using encrypted apps are private, secure, and completely secret. You're going to hear that's why encrypted applications are often used by criminals. Viber was the encrypted application the defendant and Baker used prior to the murder. And immediately after the murder, they switched to using WhatsApp, a different encrypted application. In addition to the use of the encrypted applications and burner phones, both the defendant and Baker deleted these apps from their phones and therefore also deleted almost all the associated data. However, what you're going to hear through forensic cell phone experts is that remnants or artifacts from these encrypted apps still remained on their cell phones that we were able to recover and indicated that they had previously used these encrypted apps, and you'll hear about this from various experts in digital forensics. In addition to that, in the defendant's phone under voicemails, she had saved a voicemail from Baker on December 17th of 2016 saying, just called, talk to you on Viber. So you'll hear that as corroboration regarding the encrypted apps. You're also going to hear that the defendant's Apple iCloud account associated with her iPhone shows several Viber app updates in April of 2016 to January of 2017. So again, we know she had that app installed during that time period at the very least. You'll hear that the LAPD subpoenaed business records from multiple companies throughout their investigation. The defendant used AT&T as her service provider for her iPhone. AT&T business records include a web browsing history for the defendant's mobile account for that 818 number, 424-4213. And the records show 433 entries for Viber between February 12th of 2016 and April 11th of 2017 on her account. Again, more corroboration. As I mentioned, the defendant sent numerous graphic photos of herself to Baker. Whenever you see this, that's what this represents. You're going to hear that law enforcement served search warrants on Baker's Dropbox. To Dropbox, they found approximately 28 sexually explicit photos of the defendant in Baker's Dropbox during the month of February of 2016. As I mentioned before, retired detective Mitzi Roberts reviewed this evidence, and she's going to testify about these. Now, in the middle of her affair on February 8th of 2016, this is about at 9:53 p.m., the defendant posted on Instagram. She posted a photo that you don't see here of herself and Fabio from what appeared to be their wedding with the caption that you see here, 19 years and counting. because, of course, she's trying to maintain the appearance with her husband and family that she is still a devoted wife and mother. After an apparent date night with Fabio on February 12th of 2016 at 9:26, the defendant posted another photo of herself and Fabio with glasses of wine and this caption that you see here. Later that same night, after her date night with her husband, she sent a nude selfie of herself to Baker. As the defendant was living these two separate lives, she continued to socialize with her friends, including Elise and Faye, who knew nothing about the affair. This is a photo that was taken February 20th of 2016 at approximately 7:23 p.m. What you don't see here is that later that same evening at approximately 9 p.m., the defendant is at Baker's apartment. And the reason that we know that is because there are naked pictures. And the defendant sent multiple nude photos of herself earlier on this same day from her home. You can see from the background in those photos to Baker. There's also a naked picture of the defendant later that night, as I said, at around 9 p.m. Of the defendant at Baker's apartment, found on Baker's Dropbox. Conveniently, Fabio had left town for an event in Miami that day, so the defendant was free to engage in her activities. I want to point out that it isn't just the photos that tell the relationship between the defendant and her co-conspirator, Robert Baker. Baker's Dropbox photos are just glimpses into their separate lives because no one takes photos of absolutely everything. So it just gives us a glimpse. It gives us snapshots. These are photographs taken of them out, one in February and one in March of 2016. Again, during the month of March of 2016, approximately 9 sexually explicit photos of the defendant were recovered from Baker's Dropbox, which, again, will be described for you. As I said, it isn't just the sexually graphic photos in the iCloud and the Dropbox, but it was also their behavior in front of certain friends that demonstrated the true nature of their relationship. You're going to see that the defendant and Baker went out on dates with certain friends, and they held themselves out as lovers, as a couple, as partners, and you can see that here. On the photograph on the top left, you can see Ricardo Cabrera and Sheila Salahian, a married couple. You see Monica across the table. And again, this was a night that they went out on a double date, March 12th of 2016, to a restaurant in the valley called Delmonico's where they ate lobster. Sheila and Ricardo, you're going to hear more about them in a little while. Once again, Fabio is out of town on business. He's in Minnesota at the time, so he has no idea what's going on behind his back as he's traveling for business. He was completely unaware. He never saw what was coming because the defendant would routinely lie and tell Fabio and their daughters, her family, and friends that she was going out with girlfriends for dinner, but really she was over at Baker's apartment most of the time having sex. As Fabio traveled a lot for work, his professional assistant, Alicia Truesdale at Wella, would routinely send Fabio and the defendant his itinerary and his travel plan. When Fabio was gone, as I said, the defendant would hook up with Baker. On occasion, she even had Baker over to have sex at the house in her bed. This is an example that you see here, Alicia's photograph on the top left of the type of itinerary that Alicia would always send both to the defendant and Fabio so that the defendant could keep track of his schedule and his travels and when he was going out of town, the exact times he would be picked up by limo services, when he was returning, what hotels he was staying at, and the like. So, again, we know that Fabio was out of town at the same time that the defendant and Baker were on that double date with Sheila and Ricardo, as you can see by this document here. Since the defendant always knew when Fabio would be traveling and where he would be, it made it very easy for her to be able to plan and live her secret life with Baker. While knowing where your husband was at all times would make it easy to hide an affair, knowing such information, as you can all imagine, was instrumental in setting him up to be murdered. On one of the occasions when Fabio was out of town, the defendant had Baker stay over at the family home. That's while her 2 teenage daughters were also there, and she got caught. Her older daughter, Jessica, who you'll hear from, found Baker sleeping in the defendant's bed one morning. And the defendant lied to her, convinced her that although Baker had slept over, she herself had slept in a separate room along with Sheila Salahian because they all had too much to drink the night before and couldn't drive. And of course, this was a complete fabrication. And as you'll hear from Sheila, she never slept over. She would never have been over at Monica's house, of course, without her husband, Ricardo. And so, of course, we know the defendant slept with the defendant in her bed. Beyond the fact that, again, as I'm starting to show you some of the lies that she told to her family, she also used her daughter because she made her daughter promise not to tell Fabio when he came back from business that Baker had slept over, so that she's therefore teaching her daughter to lie. Throughout their relationship, the defendant would often pose for photos, which Baker took, that they used for their swinging lifestyle. These are 3 of the most tame. You're going to hear details about them, about the volume of them that were taken, again, while the defendant was either half naked or showing off her private parts, although, again, they're too graphic to show in court. Approximately 36 sexually explicit photos of the defendant were recovered from Baker's Dropbox, taken during the month of April of 2016, which you'll hear about. In June of 2016, the defendant and Fabio decided to get a new home surveillance system, and you're going to hear that Fabio initially reached out to this company, First Digital Surveillance, on June 23rd of 2016. You're going to hear that after that date, the defendant took over the communications with the owner of the company, Sean Abdul Khan, who will be testifying. One of the main features the defendant told Khan that she personally wanted was the ability to monitor her home surveillance cameras remotely from her phone. Remember, this is 2017. This might be very common now. Back in 2017, it wasn't quite as common, but it was something that you were able to do. After the install of the surveillance system, the defendant was provided with the application that allowed her to do this. And you're going to hear that Fabio was not computer savvy and did not have the app on his cell phone. This is a critical piece of evidence in this case, as it allowed the defendant to monitor who was coming and going from her home, and when Fabio would be there alone. This made it possible for her to set up the timeline for the murder of her husband. Conveniently, on the date of install, June 28th of 2016, the defendant was the only one home when the owner of First Digital, Sean Khan, came to the residence with one of his installers. That was a day where Monica received an itinerary, and Fabio was at a work event at the Hilton in Universal City. So she was the only one home. This here shows emails from the defendant's Hotmail account showing her approving the First Digital contract and confirming approval to proceed with the installation of the surveillance system back and forth with Sean Khan. This aerial of their home at 5012 Queen Victoria Road, where the Sementilli family lived at the time and where Fabio was murdered, shows the placement of the 4 new exterior CCTV cameras and their angles or general direction. A new monitor for the surveillance system was placed in the kitchen on the counter. The DVR box that contained the recordings from the surveillance system, which was not cloud-based, if you know what I'm talking about, was installed on top of a cabinet in the garage out of sight. You can see it to the left of that of the monitor. That's actually, this is a picture taken after the murder. That's where the monitor was placed, but on top of the cabinet there is where the actual DVR box was hooked up, installed where it lived. If the DVR was stolen because the system was not cloud-based, any recordings from those cameras would obviously be lost because they weren't backed up to any type of server. They remained on the box, the DVR box. By the way, that's a picture of the Porsche that Fabio bought, parked in his garage, which you'll hear more about. IDMSS Lite was the app First Digital used, and Sean Kahn told the defendant she would need to download in order to remotely live stream her cameras from her cell phone. The app allowed the user to remotely log in and view a live video feed of their home CCTV cameras by connecting through the home's IP address if you had the correct login credentials and password to set up for the system. After install, First Digital sent defendant directions to download this app and to set up a password in order to remotely access the surveillance system cameras through her phone. She exchanged text messages with Kahn on that same day, June 28th of 2016. She initially indicated she had problems connecting her phone to the new surveillance system, but immediately after, she texted Kahn back that she successfully installed the app on her phone and was able to access her camera system. You're going to hear that Kahn and his support team confirmed that the Sementilli's surveillance system, DVR, had a unique IP address, which was part of the logon or login credentials. The Apple iCloud business records that were subpoenaed that are associated with the defendant obtained pursuant to a warrant show that the IDMS Lite app was installed on her phone on that day, June 28th of 2016, the same day as the installation. Another critical piece of evidence to note, on that same day, after the installation, the defendant forwarded the email instructions from First Digital to Robert Baker, along with her IP address, which is unique, her login credentials, and her password. You will learn that she had Baker stored under a fake name as Diane Racquetball in her contacts, in her email account and phone, to be able to hide her communication. She forwarded the email instructions that she had received from Sean Kahn, her private security code and password to Baker. That meant he could secretly watch who was also coming and going from the Sementilli home in order to set up the murder. Based on this evidence and numerous other evidentiary items that I'll continue to talk about throughout the day, you're going to learn that the defendant was not only an active participant in this conspiracy to murder her husband, but also that she was the mastermind, and without her, this murder would not have occurred. Here you can see the forwarded DVR instructions from the defendant's email sent to Robert Baker's email was one of only 4 emails she ever deleted from her Hotmail email account. You're going to hear about this from LAPD Robbery Homicide Division Officer Curtis Davis. He's an expert in cyber investigations, and he's going to tell you the forwarded email with the login directions was discovered in the defendant's deleted emails folder that's titled Deletions after her arrest. He also determined that the email address diane@rball1.com And another arball1.com domain was registered to Baker in May of 2015 and renewed in May of 2017. So we know that who she sent that to was, in fact, Robert Baker. Also, within her email account, her contact list included an entry for Diane at Arball1, and she had a nickname, or what's referred to in cyber investigation terms, a quick name for that email account was listed actually as Rob, and she had his 213 phone number that we talked about. Later, on June 28th of 2016, after the installation and after the defendant forwarded the email to Baker, Google location data associated with Baker's Gmail account shows his cell phone in the vicinity of the Sementilli residence at 5012 Queen Victoria Road, so close that it connected to the Sementilli Wi-Fi, which was saved in his phone, and you'll hear about that. On July 7th of 2016, the defendant again was at Baker's apartment on Independence, cooking and drinking wine while naked in his kitchen. You'll hear another detailed description of those photographs that were found in Baker's Dropbox. Approximately 6 days later, on July 13th of 2016, 3:50 p.m., the defendant posted on Instagram a photo of Fabio with this caption that you see here, maintaining the appearance of being a loving wife. On July 18th of 2016, the defendant forwarded an email regarding Fabio. He had an upcoming business trip in Las Vegas. You'll hear about this. This is called the Trend Vision show that they had annually, which was set for the week of July 22nd to 28th of 2016. She forwarded this email to Baker. The defendant was planning on attending the show. It was being held at the Aria. It's a big event every year, and the Aria Hotel is where Fabio and the defendant stayed during this week for the Trend Vision award shows. Again, after the defendant forwarded this email with the itinerary from Fabio's work, the defendant deleted that forwarded email, and that was, again, a second of the 4 emails found in her deletions folder. Forwarded it to Baker. On July 25th of 2016, Fabio was the MC for the Trend Vision Award show at the Aria. You see him here on the left. On the right, you see a photograph of the defendant with Fabio's sister, Morella. As I mentioned, she's also in the hair industry as a platform artist and a hair artist at the time. She attended the show. And she's going to testify, as will others, that while Fabio was busy working during the daytime in meetings and in preparations and rehearsals for the shows at night, the defendant had plenty of time to herself and would have had time to meet up with Baker in Las Vegas, given that she sent him the itinerary. In fact, independent evidence shows Baker was at the Aria during this time period, according to charges on his Chase account. On July 24th, he has a charge for self-parking at the Aria Hotel and also an ATM withdrawal from the hotel there that day where Monica was staying with Fabio. Again, in August of 2016, there's approximately 16 sexually explicit photos of the defendant, 14 of which are of the defendant having sex with other men, found in Baker's Dropbox. Same thing in September of 2016. More sexually explicit photos of the defendant having sex with a different man were found in Baker's Dropbox. In October of 2016, once again, multiple sexually explicit photos of the defendant were found in Baker's Dropbox. On November 3rd of 2016, you can see for yourself what the defendant had been planning for her future. You can see her own words written in lipstick This is Baker's bedroom in his apartment on Independence. This is his mirror where the defendant is getting dressed. You can see we've placed a privacy box across her backside. In the red circle, you can see Baker, who's taking this picture, in the background. And on the mirror in lipstick, the defendant has written the words Mrs. Baker. This is a photograph that was found in Baker's Dropbox. You're going to hear about the defendant's desire to change her last name away from Sementilli to Baker through witnesses, including Ron and Michelle Ray, as well as during recorded courthouse lockup conversations, again here in the back, between the defendant and Baker while they were awaiting trial in this matter after their arrest in June of 2017. You're going to hear that the defendant mentioned on more than one occasion that she hated being called Sementilli, that's her word, and planned to change her last name, even though her two daughters have, obviously, the last name of their father, Sementilli. You're also going to see that she used Mrs. Baker in several jail letters that are referred to as kites in the criminal justice system that she sent to Baker. And you can see that those are her signature from various jail letters on the right side. So you can see that it's the same writing that she wrote on Baker's mirror in November of 2016, planning on changing her last name to Mrs. Baker. On that same day that I just showed you the photograph of her writing in lipstick on Baker's bedroom mirror, November 3rd, Baker sent Facebook messages to a friend named Michael Spence at about 2:45 in the afternoon about his girlfriend. He mentioned he's not married, but he's involved with a 44-year-old professor. I told you the defendant taught a class on salon management at some community college back in Toronto years before. But again, she's somebody who likes to embellish, lie, exaggerate, and also is appearances are important to her. And so probably that's what she told Baker. And you can see here that Baker says they've been together for about a year and that they're probably going to start living together in 3 months. Well, if you count out from November 3rd to the date where Fabio was murdered, January 23rd of 2017, that would be the exact time frame that Baker is talking about. In this text message, Baker also mentioned she has 2 teenage daughters that are going to be going to school, and after that, he and the defendant will be free and clear. Baker goes on to tell his friend that he can stay with them after he and the defendant move in together. So you can see plans are in the works. On November 12th, 2016, Baker communicates again via Facebook Messenger with his good friend in Las Vegas, Ron Ray, who's going to travel here and testify. Again, Robert Baker says he's been with his girl for a year now, which takes us back to, obviously, somewhere around 2015. Again, he says she's 44, Italian, a college professor. You can see here that Ron Ray is asking for a picture. Ron wants to know if they're living together, and Rob says, no, not yet, but it's coming soon. You can see that there on the bottom. He and the defendant are obviously already planning to murder Fabio and live together. As Ron requested, Baker sends these pictures of the defendant on the left playing racquetball and the photograph of he and the defendant together to his friend Ron Ray, and that's on November 12th. So what this all means is that the defendant had a problem. She had a big problem. She had, in essence, created 2 worlds for herself. The comfortable life with the luxuries Fabio had earned. She didn't have to work. She had free time to go to the gym, play racquetball, shop, cook, see friends, travel, have sex with her lover. And then the other world that she created with Robert Baker, who she believed was really her true soulmate. And at some point, she realized these two worlds, they couldn't continue to coexist. But like I said, she had a problem. And her problem was a money problem. She couldn't support herself. She didn't have a job. She liked to live well. They had really nice cars. I told you there were 4 members of the Sementilli family. Each of them had a car, so they had 4 cars. She liked to buy clothes, shoes, whatever she wanted. She enjoyed going on these fancy vacations, but she needed money. And divorce wasn't an option because she came from an Italian Catholic family, which she and Baker discussed in recorded lockup conversations, once again, that you're going to hear about. She also, as I mentioned multiple times, cared about appearances, and she knew if she divorced Fabio, who was so beloved, even by her family, he was someone who took care of her family when they needed it. For someone with no future, a sex offender, a registered sex offender like Robert Baker, she would be disowned. She would be shunned. She would be cut out from her social circle, and especially from her Italian family, who loved Fabio like a son. So this leads us to the issue of motive. And as you heard during jury selection, motive is not an element we have to prove, but it's a big issue in this case. Financial gain as a special circumstance is one of the motives in this case. So she and Baker decided that Fabio was getting in the way of their future plans to be together, for her to become Mrs. Baker. If she divorced Fabio, she was going to lose her social standing and many, if not all, of her friends. Her family would never forgive her, and they would never accept somebody like Robert Baker, who, as I said, was nothing like Fabio. But if her beloved husband was murdered, people would feel sorry for her. She would be a victim. And therefore, they might forgive and accept what they would think were just poor decisions by somebody who was a sad, grieving widow. Also, as you're going to hear, if Fabio was murdered, she stood to inherit a great deal of money through Fabio's insurance policy, his stock options, and other assets he had set up through his hard work for his family's benefit. That was the whole point of leaving the hairdressing world to become a VP in this big company. And the defendant realized that the only way to maintain a reputation as Fabio's devoted wife and a mother to their children without the risk of turning everyone against her was to become a victim. The only way to get rid of Fabio and shed her old life without losing the lifestyle to which she was accustomed was to kill her husband. So instead of being seen as this self-centered, ungrateful liar and cheat, everyone would feel sorry for her because she would become Fabio's devastated widow who lost the love of her life. And what you're going to learn very quickly from the evidence is that the defendant is a master at manipulation and also a very convincing actor. In fact, you're going to hear she bragged about what a great actress she is to certain witnesses in this case, and that she used Fabio's murder so she could get a deal on a new car for her daughter when her daughter got in an accident, and to buy herself a brand new Mustang. And so at some point in 2016, a conspiracy was happening. The defendant and her lover, the co-conspirator, killed Fabio in order to create their life together. True to form, the defendant left it to someone else to do her dirty work for her. She left it up to Baker to determine how to get the job done. He was a criminal. He had friends. He had ways of getting things like this done. And as you heard, according to conspiracy law, you don't have to know everybody in the conspiracy. You don't have to be friends with them. You don't have to know what role they're going to play. Robert Baker, who had friends who were loyal to him, like a young guy named Christopher Austin, who would do whatever Baker asked him to do and not ask a lot of questions. He was Baker's patsy, I'm going to call it. And at the end of last year, 2024, law enforcement finally had put together sufficient evidence to arrest and charge Baker's crime companion after 7 years of only having the defendant and Baker charged on this case. They finally thought that they had sufficient evidence to arrest who they knew went to the crime scene with Baker, this guy, Chris Austin. He was initially investigated by Detective Mitzi Roberts, you're going to hear about. She started putting records together, evidence together, but it was thin. And then you're going to hear after she retired, Detectives Farrell and Byers dug in a little deeper, got more records, and came across some more evidence that they believed was sufficient in order for them to set up an operation in Vancouver, Washington, where Christopher Austin was now living with his wife and baby. You're going to hear that at the time of the murder, he actually lived in Alaska. This is Chris Austin. You're going to hear that LAPD officers from Robbery Homicide Division, where Detective Roberts worked and where Detective Farrell and Byers worked, took a team of officers, went up to Vancouver, Washington, coordinated an operation with law enforcement up there where they knew Austin was living, and they arrested him. And they placed him in a cell, you're going to hear, with an undercover law enforcement agent who posed as his cellmate. You're going to hear that this is a completely legal type of undercover operation that is sometimes used by law enforcement. And you're going to hear that Austin made various statements to his, what he thought was his cellmate, his cellie. And he only told a very small part of the story because he was very hesitant to speak, as you can imagine, to someone he didn't even know about this murder he had committed. It was, as you'll hear, his first arrest. He had never been in trouble before. He hadn't even met with a lawyer yet. And you're going to hear, when referring to the defendant in his conversations with his cellmate, Austin said he didn't even really know her. But again, as you've heard, that doesn't matter. Because although he had met the defendant on more than one occasion, they weren't friends. They certainly didn't run in the same social circle. And Austin told his cellmate that law enforcement, in their conversations with him, they knew about the burner phones, they knew about everything. Because these detectives, when they went up to conduct this operation, were well prepared. And you're going to hear that the undercover cellmate, after listening to Austin talk to the LAPD detectives who came to the cell door to say, look, we know about this. We know about that. So don't think you can lie to us. The cellmate, the undercover agent, says to Austin, to me it sounded like it's the bitch who planned everything. Because again, these agents know that they have to talk in a way, use language in a way such that they will be trusted by the individual that they're put into the cell with. And Austin's statement from the very beginning was, yeah, she did. And you're going to hear the cellmate asked what was the reason for the murder, and Austin responded, life insurance. Austin told his cellmate how on the day of the murder, he and Baker drove up a hill and parked the car. Then they ran up the hill to the house. And you're going to hear that that actually is consistent. The Sementilli home was located on a hill on Queen Victoria. Austin told his cellmate that they were in a rental car, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. Austin also admitted that they stabbed the victim in the neck, possibly 3 times. And Austin admitted that he himself had stabbed the victim once. Had he just been a lookout, had he had some other role, perhaps perhaps he wouldn't now be convicted of murder. But once he admitted to personally stabbing and admitting that, the only charge had to be a murder charge. And so you're going to hear that instead of trying to push the blame over onto Baker, which is what criminals often do, it wasn't me, it was that guy, which is what you're going to hear Baker do for the defendant. Austin took the blame. He said, I personally stabbed him in the neck once. He said he didn't know what Baker took, but he admitted they stole the victim's vehicle. He also admitted that he got some gold coins from the house. And Austin said that he left that night, left town, went home, and spoke to Baker after he got back home in the days after the murder on a burner phone. And you're going to hear that Austin stated from the very beginning, I believe she set the whole thing up. You're going to hear that in addition to the recordings that went on in the cell, that the detectives, along with my trial partner, Heather Stagel, interviewed Chris Austin in Vancouver, Washington. You're going to hear that he was Mirandized, that he agreed to speak to the detectives and asked to speak to the DA who was there without his attorney. He told some of the details of the story that night, but not the entire story until he was extradited to Los Angeles and met with his lawyer. You're going to hear that at the time, as I mentioned, not only did he not have a criminal record, but he was working for the state of Oregon as a probation and a parole officer for juveniles. He had no prior record. You're going to hear that he knew Baker as a childhood friend through his father, and that he had worked for Baker at the age of 19 for 2 to 3 years as his personal assistant, that they lived together in Las Vegas as well as in the Los Angeles area. You're going to hear that these detectives showed him a photo of the defendant, and Austin admitted that he had seen the defendant, Monica Sementilli, before at a gym 6 to 7 months prior to the murder, and that was at LA Fitness when he came into town and went with Baker to the gym, and that he even played racquetball when he was in town to visit Baker in 2016 with the defendant. He also told them that he had even been to her home before the murder, that he went to the house with Baker several months prior, and he told the detectives that the defendant and Baker were doing kissy-kissy at her house. In July of 2016, he told detectives that he went to Las Vegas with Baker and that they stayed with their mutual friend, Al Birdsong, someone he referred to as Uncle Bird. You're going to hear that he referred to Baker as Uncle Rob, and Al Birdsong, who at the time was working for the Department of Homeland Security, they referred to him as Uncle Bird. This was the same time, remember, July 2016, when I told you about the defendant sending the itinerary for Fabio's Trend Vision award shows in 2016, when she was there with Fabio, that he and Baker also went to Vegas during that time period. And you're going to hear that the detectives were tipped off to this by another witness in this case, Paula McCullum, who you'll hear about a little later. During this interview that occurred in Vancouver, Washington, on January 22nd of 2017, Austin told them that he flew into LAX to commit the murder and that Baker picked him up. These detectives already knew that. They already had the record. The next day, on January 23rd of 2017, Austin said he just did what Uncle Rob told him to do. Rob told him it was time to go at some point because the defendant said the victim was in the house alone. Rob, again, parked this rental car he was driving, and they ran up there to the victim's house. And you're going to see that that was captured on surveillance video, and I'm going to play that for you later. He told the detectives that he entered the Sementilli home with Baker, that they found the victim on the back patio. He admitted that Baker held Fabio down and stabbed him in the neck twice, and that he himself, Austin, stabbed Fabio in the neck once. And that afterwards they fled in Fabio's Porsche, and that Baker gave him some gold coins. Unfortunately for him, what law enforcement dug up was that 45 minutes after that murder, Austin was ticketed driving that rental car, the same rental car that they drove to the crime scene that day. And once Rob Baker learned that Austin had been ticketed in the rental car, Rob knew he had to get Austin out of there. So he told him, you have to get out of here. You're not supposed to leave till tomorrow, but you need to change your plans and your ticket and leave now. And you're going to hear that Baker dropped him off at a shuttle, the Van Nuys flyaway, that took him to the terminal at LAX. And you're going to hear that he told these detectives that after he returned home, Baker gave him some money to buy a burner phone, and that he and Baker then communicated on their respective burner phones, that Rob got a new phone as well. And the two of them then communicated on these burner phones.
Let me get another slide. We're going to do this. With that in mind, anytime during the case,
Please excuse me if my voice cracks and I drink water as I'm doing this. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm going to be talking all day. You're going to hear that in this case, once Austin was extradited to Los Angeles on the charges, he met with his lawyer, and then he had what's referred to sometimes as a proffer interview. That means that there's paperwork that goes up the chain of command in the DA's office that a charged defendant in a criminal case wants to make a statement to the DA and to law enforcement in exchange perhaps for testifying at trial. And you're going to hear that anytime you have a conspiracy case like this where a defendant requests a deal, there's as I said, a protocol. And you're going to see the type of paperwork and hear about the type of paperwork, as you see here, that gets generated. So in a case like this, as I mentioned during jury selection, we may elect to use a participant like Austin in order to give the jury details you otherwise wouldn't have. A behind-the-scenes look, so to speak, to give you additional evidence so that you're able to perhaps evaluate the testimony of, let's say, a witness like Robert Baker when he gets on the stand properly. Additional evidence to assist you in making decisions. I'm sure you've heard the phrase before on television shows that sometimes the government makes deals with smaller fish to get the bigger fish. And you're going to hear that in this case, Austin was in a very different position as a defendant than Baker, given his lack of criminal record and the way he was brought into this conspiracy, or from the defendant who orchestrated the entire thing for her own benefit. And you're going to hear that Austin talked about Baker like he was family. He was a close friend of his dad's back from South or North Carolina and had grown up with him and then worked for him, as I mentioned. And you're going to hear that in November of 2024, he and his lawyer sat down with my partner and I and the detectives and gave a recorded statement. And that he was told that he would be given no promises in exchange for anything that day until his statement was vetted and corroborated by independent evidence. And that whatever he told us that day couldn't be used against him unless he got up on the stand and lied. Then we could use it for impeachment purposes or to say, you said this before. However, we weren't going to make him any promises or any deals that day. So he had to do this on a leap of faith along with his lawyer, that he believed he had information to provide that would assist a jury in a case like this. And you're going to hear that he laid out some parts of the planning that went into the conspiracy, that the parts that he knew of at least, that began in 2016. And that he went through the details of his trip with Baker to Las Vegas in July of 2016, when I told you the defendant was there with Fabio and Morella for the Trend Vision show, that he flew to Los Angeles on Baker's dime, and then he and Baker drove to Vegas, that they went to Birdsong's house, that every time they were in Vegas, they stayed with Al Birdsong. He remembers he and Baker actually went to the Aria. He may have even met with the defendant at the Aria, but he doesn't have a clear memory of that now, all these years later. However, while he was in Vegas, he and Baker and Birdsong talked about how to go about killing the defendant's husband. And Baker said he needed Austin to help him take out Fabio, that the defendant was the one who wanted it done, and that Baker and Birdsong and he talked about what to do, and they ruled out a shooting because it would cause too much noise, and that Baker wanted Austin to do the crime alone because no one really knew him in the LA area. And the plan was then that they formulated that they were going to stab Fabio in the neck, stab him to death. And that Baker was on the phone a lot with the defendant. And that Baker and the defendant wanted Austin to come to Los Angeles in early January of 2017 to commit the murder because the victim was supposed to, according to Austin, be traveling somewhere in late January. And indeed, a piece of corroborating evidence came out. Fabio was supposed to be traveling for business on Saturday, January 28th, 2017 to Boston. That's information that could only have obviously come from the defendant. And Austin talked about how when he came to Los Angeles, he went to LA Fitness, maybe sometime, he thought, in September or October of 2016, and he played racquetball with the defendant. And later that night, he and Baker went to the defendant's home, and it was just the three of them there. And she ordered pizza. And he watched television and ate pizza on the couch while Baker and the defendant went off to have sex. And that they showed him, defendant showed him the patio area where Fabio liked to hang out that I told you about. And Baker and the defendant told Austin that's where Fabio likes to hang out, because remember, the plan was for Austin to commit the crime alone. Baker and Austin also spoke by phone in December of 2016, and the topic of the insurance money came up. Baker told him the victim bought a brand new fucking Porsche. He got money. And Baker said the defendant was going to get some money after this murder. And Baker told Austin, if you do this, I'll get her to give you some of the money from her life insurance, really meaning Fabio's life. And that Baker was talking numbers in the area between $30,000 to $50,000 for Austin coming out, committing this murder and helping out his friend Baker. But Austin never spoke to the defendant directly about the murder. But again, the law says that doesn't matter. After the Las Vegas trip, Baker and Austin continued to discuss the murder and its planning to commit this murder of Fabio Sementilli. And Baker sent Austin some money. At some point, he sends him an ATM card you're going to hear about. He also sends him money to buy airline tickets to fly to LAX on January 22nd of 2017. And I told you the detectives, they had already tracked down all of that information. However, shockingly, what comes out of Austin's mouth during our interview of him in November of last year was something no one ever knew. He says he flew in January 22nd. We knew that Baker had picked him up at LAX that morning. We knew that Austin left his cell phone home at Baker's direction so he couldn't be tracked. He admitted that he knew he was coming into town to commit this murder. We know per cellular data, as you'll hear from a forensic expert, that Baker left his apartment around 6:30 in the morning that day, arrived at LAX at 7 a.m. Alaska airline records show Austin arrived at 7:34 a.m. Baker and Austin then leave LAX around 8 a.m. per Robert Baker's cellular data, and they return to the San Fernando Valley where Baker lived on Independence and Canoga Park around 8:30 in the morning, again, per cellular data. And then came the shocking part. The defendant calls Baker at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Austin, and she tells him she's going to send Fabio out to pick up dinner. She's going to send her husband out to pick up dinner that night, and they decide that Austin is going to murder Fabio at this location when Fabio goes to pick up food for Monica and the girls and him to eat that night. And this was an extremely significant piece of evidence that corroborated things we had not known about. None of this was ever known. None of it was ever noticed in going through the evidence that it was potentially relevant that Fabio went somewhere that night to pick up food until Austin gave this interview on November 18th and November 20th at the end of last year to the LAPD detectives and my partner and I. And at that point, we were able to go back to look at the defendant's record, to look at Baker's record, to look at Fabio's mobile device records and confirm exactly what Austin told us. All of this was corroborated and captured by cellular data from Baker's cell phone, and you're going to hear about this from a forensic geolocation expert witness, Ray. After the call from the defendant saying she's sending Fabio out to pick up food, Baker and Austin drive away from Baker's apartment on Independence to the area of 19548 Ventura Boulevard in the Valley. This is a strip mall location where there's a pho restaurant. Some people say pho, some people say pho. It's a restaurant where they serve noodles and other types of Chinese food. While in the area of this restaurant, Foso 1, you're going to hear the defendant and Baker exchange 69 encrypted Viber messages between 3:30 in the afternoon and 6 p.m. You're going to hear about that from Ray. Baker and Austin waited at this location for several hours for Fabio to arrive. And during his interview, you're going to see here what's circled. Austin marked the location where Baker parked while they waited for Fabio to arrive. The defendant was going to tell them. And Baker told Austin, hey, Fabio's a big dude. And you're going to hear Fabio was, in fact, a very large man. And Baker showed Austin a picture of Fabio on his phone. Baker also described that Fabio was going to be driving a truck, a dark-colored blue or black truck. And then at some point, Baker tells Austin he got a text from the defendant letting them know that Fabio should be there at the location. Now, this activity is also seen on the defendant's as well as Fabio Sementilli's iPhone text messages in reference to the faux restaurant at this Ventura Boulevard location that I mentioned. At 6 p.m., Fabio is in the immediate area of this location. It was called Faux Cal. It's now called FOSO 1. Fabio is the area highlighted in the green. Baker is still in the area per his cell data, and that's what you see here highlighted in red. And you'll hear about what all this means, as I said, from a geolocation expert. You'll hear that when told Fabio arrived, Baker told Austin to get out of the car and do the job. And Austin got out of Baker's vehicle. He says he went around some pillars. We didn't know what location he was talking about at the time, and you can see there are pillars from this back parking lot to the front of the shopping center, and he saw Fabio's truck parked in the lot, and he circled, as you see on the right, the location where he saw Fabio's truck parked. And Austin identifies that location of where that was on the night of January 22nd. And then he sees Fabio coming out of the pho place with a bag in his hands, but Austin gets nervous because he's not a criminal, and he goes back to Baker's vehicle and says he couldn't do it. But we would never have known that that was the night that they planned to murder Fabio. That was an attempted murder. Never knew about this until the end of November of last year. Sure.
Take our lunch recess until 1:30.
To Los Angeles, and how he brought up a piece of evidence that we had no idea about. I also want to mention that in his interview with us, as you will hear about, he described, as I mentioned, that they were parked in the back parking lot behind this strip mall. He described the strip mall as being L-shaped. He described there being a nail place in there, I think a couple other different locations, but we didn't know what location he was talking about. And even though he, and I don't even know if he knew it was pho or he didn't know the name of the place. He just remembered it being this strip mall. And so during the course of this interview, what you're going to hear is that as he was describing it, we were looking up in Fabio Sementilli's cell phone extraction what he was doing on this day. And what we found was that he and the defendant were communicating, and he searched on his phone, "Pho near me." And then he sent a message to the defendant about the location. The defendant searches this particular location in her cell phone, because we had, as we'll talk about, cell phone extractions from the phones we actually did recover at the time of arrest. And so during the course of the interview on our computers, we were able to bring up a photograph of the location at 19548 Ventura Boulevard and show it to him, and he identified it. So he was talking about a location, and we didn't know where it was. And so by looking back at, as I said, what the defendant and Fabio were searching on January 22nd during this interview at 5:11 Bella, the younger daughter, and asks if she wants fried rice. I think that's why I said I thought other Chinese, it's Vietnamese, but she asked if she wanted fried rice. And so there was this whole back and forth exchange, as I was talking about, that actually led us to Boston when he was extradited to Los Angeles, and how he brought up a piece of evidence that we had no idea about. I also want to mention that in his interview with us, as you will hear about, he described, as I mentioned, that they were parked in the back parking lot behind this strip mall. He described the strip mall as being L-shaped. He described there being a nail place in there, I think a couple other different locations, but we didn't know what location he was talking about. And even though he, and I don't even know if he knew it was Pho, or he didn't know the name of the place, he just remembered it being this strip mall. And so during the course of this interview, what you're going to hear is that as he was describing it, we were looking up in Fabio Sementilli's cell phone extraction what he was doing on this day. And what we found was that he and the defendant were communicating, and he searched on his phone, "Pho near me." And then he sent a message to the defendant about the location. The defendant searches this particular location in her cell phone, because we had, as we'll talk about, cell phone extractions from the phones we actually did recover at the time of arrest. And so during the course of the interview on our computers, we were able to bring up a photograph of the location at 19548 Ventura Boulevard and show it to him, and he identified it. So he was talking about a location and we didn't know where it was. And so by looking back at, as I said, what the defendant and Fabio were searching on January 22nd during this interview at 5:11 to 5:13, the defendant and Fabio are going back and forth talking about locations. And then at 5:41, the defendant texts her daughter, Bella, the younger daughter, and asks if she wants fried rice. I think that's why I said I thought other Chinese, it's Vietnamese, but she asked if she wanted fried rice. And so there was this whole back and forth exchange, as I was talking about, that actually led us to discover the location based on the searches in the defendant and Fabio's cell phone extractions. And when we identified the location, because it was contained in the defendant's searches, as she was sending messages through Viber to Baker, and knowing what time Fabio would arrive, that's how we were able to find out what the location was. And during this time, between 5:11 and 5:41, I told you earlier that the defendant and Baker had exchanged 69 encrypted Viber messages, which obviously we'll never be able to see the content, but you can probably imagine. But between 5:11 and 5:41, she and Baker are exchanging 17 Viber messages, again, encrypted messages. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear as to how we were able to identify that location through our interview with Mr. Austin. So as I said, Chris Austin just couldn't bring himself to do this murder, goes back to the car, tells Baker, I couldn't do it. And Baker says, I'll let the defendant know the murder didn't go down, because you can just imagine she's waiting at home to hear that her husband's been murdered, and he walks through the door with and he tells Austin later that night that he was going to meet with the defendant and figure out what to do. Baker then tells Austin that the defendant wants it to happen quickly, so he, being Baker, decides and tells Austin, I'll go with you. I'll go with you. We'll kill Fabio together, because he can see that Austin's not going to be able to do this. That brings us to Monday, the day of the actual murder of Fabio Sementilli. Monday, January 23rd of 2017. The defendant and Baker decide that Fabio is going to have to be killed at home that day. He had taken the day off from work. He was working at home, and I want you to pay attention throughout the trial and some of the slides I'm going to show you today to the extremely tight timeline from that day, the window that existed when Fabio would be alone and this murder could occur, which could only happen with inside information from the defendant, ensuring when that exact time frame would be when Fabio would be alone, and it would be the time for him to be murdered. So in our interview with Christopher Austin, he talks about what happened on January 23rd of 2017. He is told by Baker that the defendant's going to figure out how to get the victim alone, that Baker was getting information from the defendant by phone that she was going to leave at some point during the day to go to a store, and that Fabio would be home alone. And at that point, Baker told Austin, we have to go immediately. We have to go now. Now is our window of time. And Baker drives them in a rental vehicle to the Sementilli residence, where Baker parks at some area below the street, and they jog up the hill to the Sementilli home. And Baker tells Austin that the defendant said she was going to leave the front door unlocked, that Fabio would be on the back patio, and Austin told us that's how they knew when they came into the home through the front door to go to the back patio, because that's where Fabio was, and the defendant even told Baker that Fabio was watching TV back there. It's true. So Austin, again, in his interview with us, rather than blame shifting, says, basically admits that he went to that location knowing they were going there to commit this murder, and that they had planned to do this, and that they entered the home. You'll see from the pictures of the home, there's some windows when you come in out to the backyard where the pool area is, and that they saw Fabio sitting on the back porch smoking a cigar. And they went out the kitchen door. They attacked, Fabio on the back patio. Fabio tried to yell, but Baker covered his mouth. Baker started stabbing Fabio. And then Austin stabbed Fabio, he said, once in the neck. Baker then tells Austin he has to make it look like a robbery. And Austin knew prior to going to the location that the plan was that they were going to take the Porsche, because the defendant had told Baker, and Baker told Austin that she's going to leave the keys to it, visible. And so Baker directs Austin to, Austin is now freaking out. Baker directs Austin to go in the garage, get into the Porsche, while Baker staged the crime scene to make it look like a robbery gone bad. And he sees, after a period of time, Baker come into the garage. Baker goes to the top of that cabinet where I showed you the DVR box had been installed. He unhooks the DVR box. He takes it with him because, again, as I told you, not cloud-based. You take the box, all the video that's on it is gone. And Baker then gets into the Porsche with not only the DVR, but a pillowcase that was appeared to have some contents inside. So now I want to show you the evidence, some of the evidence that we have independent of Austin's interview, what we had before we even knew about Austin or the information that he was able to provide us. So the defendant and Baker start communicating on Viber early in the morning on that day of the murder at 6:50 when the defendant contacts Baker. When you see the green lines that are going towards Baker's phone, that's indicative that she is communicating, she is contacting him via the Encrypted app. You can make calls or you can send text messages, but they're encrypted. And so her phone contacts his phone at 6:50 in the morning. That's the first contact for the day. You're going to hear that business records were obtained from Viber via search warrant that show numerous messages between the defendant's cell and Baker's cell. And I told you about those 2 phone numbers that you'll see in the records and hear about throughout the trial, and that they show numerous messages between them on the afternoon as well of January 23rd of 2017. In fact, as you see here on the right, log entries, a log entry covered via a forensic cell phone extraction of the defendant Sementilli's iPhone showed she accessed Viber on January 23rd, also at 7:21 a.m. local time. You'll hear that in terms of phone records, because there's going to be a lot of talk about that, and Viber records, that many of these records have to be converted for time. So they run on a 24-hour clock, but you'll hear there's something called UTC, Universal Coordinated Time, and that it depends on which state you're in. Usually California is UTC minus 8 hours. So you'll hear about that. This is a graphic showing you of who is home at Queen Victoria at the residence that morning. And we know that the housekeeper, Delia Rivera, comes to the home that day. And you also need to keep in mind, as you're listening to the evidence in this case, who knew Fabio's schedule and everyone else's that lived in that home and who worked at that home and who would be at that home that day. Fabio, you're going to hear, occasionally worked from home, but when he did so, he was always in the backyard, and everybody who knew Fabio knew that that was his favorite place. In fact, you're going to hear he even had a favorite chair where he would sit facing the television with his back to the pool, sort of at an angle towards the kitchen and the fire pit. And so you have to ask yourself, again, who knew when Fabio was going to be home that day? Who knew that he would even be home that day? Alicia, you're going to hear, his personal assistant, knew he was going to be home that day, communicated with him. His boss, the CEO of the company, Sal Mucheri, who's going to fly in and testify, corresponded with Fabio, knew he was going to be home that day. And also the housekeeper, Delia Rivera, when she came to the house that day, she obviously saw that Fabio was there and therefore realized he was home that day. And his daughter, Jessica, when she woke up that day, because as we know, at some point in the morning, the youngest, Isabella, leaves and goes to school before she would know whether Fabio was going to work from home that day. And of course, the other person that knows is the defendant. So here at 7:28 in the morning, Bella leaves for school. That leaves the defendant home with his daughter and his wife. 8:05, Delia, the housekeeper, comes, bless you, to clean the house at 8:06. You're going to hear from her as well. During the trial, you're going to hear that a witness by the name of Paula McCullum was interviewed several times by the LAPD. She was a member of the racquetball league at LA Fitness with her husband, Sean McCullum. I showed you a picture of him with Baker earlier this morning. And you're going to hear that she had an affair with Baker at some point previous. And she initially did not tell law enforcement the truth about the fact that she had this affair because she didn't want her husband to know. But she eventually says that she had had an affair with Baker, that she had fallen in love with him. You're going to hear she visited him in jail several times after his arrest, wrote him some letters. And that on the morning of the murder, January 23rd of 2017, that Monday, Baker asks her, they're no longer involved because obviously he's now having an affair with Monica, the defendant. He asks Paula to rent him a vehicle just for that day because he says that his vehicle was broken. He had I think it was a black Ford Expedition, and his vehicle was unusable. And so he and Paula go to the Enterprise rental company in Canoga Park at 11 a.m. that day. You're going to hear that that is corroborated by Baker cellular data activity showing him there. And she rents under her name for Baker a silver Nissan Versa note. And here you can see the invoice. And obviously, what she'll tell you is that she had no idea. He told her you needed it just to get around for the day and do various things. She had no idea that he was going to use it as a getaway vehicle to commit a murder. And so she rents the car, and law enforcement, as I said, had interviewed her multiple times, but she did not want to tell them that she had done this because she thought somehow that would get her in trouble. But eventually she admits to law enforcement during one of her interviews that she in fact had rented a vehicle for Baker on the day that Monica Sementilli's husband had been murdered. And so that happens during an interview on September 19th of 2018 by LAPD's detectives. They then go with her to the Enterprise rental car. They retrieve the invoice that you see. And again, more pieces of the puzzle start coming together in this case. By way of really a side note, she just happened to mention to them that Baker's nephew from Alaska had come to LA and that Baker brought him to LA Fitness where they played racquetball with the defendant. And that was subsequently something that was looked into when they heard he had a nephew from Alaska. That turned out to be Christopher Austin. And she also made a side comment that she knew that both the defendant and Baker were in Las Vegas at the same time in 2016, which obviously was corroborated by photographic evidence that I've shown you today, as well as Austin, because she remembers Baker saying Austin had flown into LAX. They were going for the weekend to drive to the weekend to Vegas, and that the following week, when she saw the defendant at racquetball, the defendant mentioned that she had been in Vegas the week before. So she's starting to put things together. So she mentions this, but she doesn't know the name Christopher Austin. And she doesn't really remember even what he looks like. So this is the rental vehicle that the silver Nissan Versa note that Paula McCullum rents and the Robert Baker drives as the getaway car for that day. At 11:42 in the morning, the defendant and her older daughter, Jessica, leave the residence for LA Fitness. They go in Jessica's red Mustang, as you see here, and they're caught on what you see here, which is the neighborhood surveillance video. You'll hear that the timestamp is off, so we've put the correct time on the video that you see in the bottom left corner, and you'll see that throughout various exhibits. In an interview by LAPD, on the night of this murder, Jessica told detectives that she worked out with her mother that morning at the gym. Her mother did not play racquetball. Her mother was not with Baker, but you're going to hear that over the course of the years, as this case has been pending, after speaking with her mother's lawyers over multiple times, she has now changed her story. Now, I want to just make a comment about this. So this case obviously is a very difficult situation when you have a murder that happens within a family. Because as you can imagine, when you have children where one parent is murdered and the other one is accused of causing that murder and destroying their lives, they aren't always wanting to see what might be referred to as justice. You're going to hear from the daughters in this case that they're going to have very mixed feelings about their testimony because, as you can imagine, just common sense, human nature, they don't want to see anything happen to their mother. And so, again, you were told that during the course of the testimony in this case, you're going to have to make credibility calls. But I would caution you that that is something that I think it makes common sense to everybody, and you probably all know what I'm saying. But you want to keep that in mind, that sometimes witnesses will change or try to change or color their testimony to try to bring about a certain result, just as you're going to see with Robert Baker, because they have various motives. And the judge is going to read you instructions in this case.
This is argument. It's on to the opening statement.
The judge is going to read you instructions in this case that there are various things that you can take into account in judging the credibility of a witness, such as bias and interest and motive to lie. And so all of those are things that I expect you will take into account when you're looking at the witnesses that get on the stand. And again, one of the ways around this is something defense counsel brought up in his voir dire, is by looking for corroboration. Is there corroboration for what certain witnesses are saying? So surveillance video here shows the defendant arriving at LA Fitness at 11:49 that morning while Jessica parked her Mustang. The surveillance video also shows Baker arriving 10 minutes later after the defendant's arrival to the LA Fitness. There was a text. As I said, Fabio, he's not using encrypted apps. He's just using regular text messages. So when we look through his cell phone download or extraction, he sends a message to the defendant saying, "Hi, babe, just got home, 12:31. And you're going to hear that he went to try and get a power washer fixed that morning, and then he was home working for the rest of the day. Again, here's additional surveillance video from the lobby at LA Fitness. You can see Baker there on the left. He's exiting at 12:43 and 7 seconds in this black sweatsuit with the stripe down the side of his jacket. It's also on his pants. And the defendant and Jessica leaving basically 13 seconds later at 12:43 and 20 seconds. And you can see where the yellow arrow is pointing to Baker's legs just outside the door of the lobby area. The defendant then responds to her husband, "We're on our way home." And she drives home with Jessica. And so now at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you have these individuals at home in the house. And then the defendant puts herself in a position to know exactly where everybody is that day. She sends a text message to her daughter Isabella to find out when Isabella is returning that afternoon from school, because at 1:40 she knew that Isabella would be getting out of school. After school, she had an interview at a deli, and then she was going to stop at a local optometrist in the San Fernando Valley to pick up a pair of glasses. And text me after your interview, let me know when you're on your way. and you saw Isabella responded. So at 2:15, Delia, the housekeeper, is done cleaning. The house is completely clean. She leaves the residence, and now you have Fabio home with his wife and his eldest daughter. At 3 o'clock, wearing that same striped sweatsuit, Baker arrives at the local Woodland Hills Target store in the rented Nissan Versa note, and you're going to see surveillance video of this. He drives around the lot, and you'll see he parks to the one far side of the parking lot, and he actually backs his car into the lot and towards the front, and then he enters the store at 3:02. The defendant then sends another message to Isabella telling her good luck. Like I said, she had an interview that afternoon, and Isabella responds. At 3:19, on the surveillance video from the local Target, you see Baker exiting, carrying the bag, wearing that same sweatsuit we talk about. And to the right, what you see is he takes his car that's to the front of the lot, and he parks it all the way to the rear of the lot, where there really aren't parking spots. It's an area really that's like a loading zone, and there's an area where you can walk through, and you're going to hear about that particular lot and its layout from LAP Detective Mitzi Roberts. So at 3:24, he takes the car and he reparks it to the back of the lot, and the vehicle stays there. The defendant then leaves her residence to go to Target to meet up with Baker, and this occurs at 3:26 in the afternoon, 2 minutes after Baker reparked his car to the back of the Target lot, and she's going to run some errands so that she can establish an alibi that she's not home when this murder goes down. Surveillance video shows that she arrives at the Target at 3:29, so it basically takes her 3 minutes to get to the local Target. You're going to hear that she stops as she comes into the Target lot. You'll see the video, and appears to stop as she's driving in where there used to be in this Target lot a Payless shoe store that you're going to hear about. She stops, and you can see a grainy figure come around the front of her vehicle as it stopped there at the Payless, and perhaps open the door and get into the front passenger seat. And then at that point, the defendant parks her car to the center of the lot, further back from the store, and she sits and parks in the car for several minutes. And at this point, all the Viber communications between the defendant and Baker stop. And why did they stop? They stop because Baker's in the car with her, because they're together. And you're going to hear from the instructions the judge is going to give you that you're entitled to use common sense and draw all reasonable inferences from the evidence. Surveillance video then shows, you won't see anybody get out from the front passenger side of her vehicle because it's the opposite side of the car from where the Target cameras are, but subsequently shows she reparks. She takes her vehicle and she drives up to the front of the lot and reparks her car in front of the Target store at 3:35. The surveillance video then shows, after she does this, Baker exits the Target lot at 3:36. Again, unless you're somebody who really believes in coincidences. And he leaves in the rental car from the Target lot. And you'll see on the video his car is pulling out of the lot at 3:36. He then goes, as we know, through Christopher Austin back to his apartment to pick up Austin. Surveillance video at that point catches the defendant entering the Target store at 3:38. You can see her there. And now only Fabio and Jessica are home. And so what does the defendant do? She sends a text to Jessica. Don't be late for babysitting. This is at 3:40 in the afternoon because Jessica was supposed to go to babysit for a friend. And Jessica responds that she won't. And again, this is the defendant ensuring that Fabio is alone at the house again, for a very short period of time so that Baker and Austin can kill him. And then here again, at between 3:47 and 4:54, Fabio is alone at the home. So again, we're talking about a very, very tight timeline. At 3:47, Jessica leaves the residence. Fabio's now alone. There's this brief window before Isabella is due to return from school, her job interview, and picking up her glasses from the optometrist. And of course, the only one who knows about this very narrow window and could create this opportunity is the defendant. Baker couldn't know when Bella would come home and Jessica would leave unless the defendant was keeping tabs on everyone and updating him as she did the night before when they tried to kill Fabio, as you recall, at the strip mall. The defendant had to ensure everyone else is out of the house, leaving Fabio alone, and she knows Fabio is working in the backyard and relayed this information to Baker. Now, you're going to hear that at 3:53 p.m., about 6 minutes after Jessica leaves the residence, the defendant accesses her surveillance cameras through that IDMSS Lite app on her phone that we talked about earlier today, so that she can remotely view who's outside, if anyone, and whose vehicles are outside the house while she's at the target. She's doing this to ensure that Fabio is home alone. And you're going to hear that this was proven by her forensic cell phone extraction. You're going to hear about this from an expert, Officer Curtis Davis, who I mentioned before, as well as a cell phone extraction analysis expert, Jake Gibson. You're also going to hear that the defendant's AT&T mobility records show a very high use of data during this time period. And again, this will be explained to you as being consistent with using her phone to access her home surveillance system. AT&T internet history records also confirm that on January 23rd, 2017, at about 4 o'clock local time, the defendant used her iPhone to access her home's IP address. Because again, as I told you earlier today, in order to access the cameras, you have to go through your home's IP address. So you're going to hear about that, and that as she's watching her home surveillance cameras, she's obviously using data or downloading data from her home CCTV surveillance system. This is 4:18 p.m. The surveillance video. And here you can see 2 individuals, faces, hands, everything covered, jogging up the street toward the Sementilli home. That's Baker and Austin. They're caught on a neighborhood surveillance video. They jog up the street. They turn onto Queen Victoria Road towards the Sementilli home. You could see from the video their faces are completely covered. Baker is the one in front wearing the green Sean John sweatshirt. Austin behind wearing a black zip-up hoodie that he will testify about that he was given by Baker before they left the apartment to cover themselves. Because, again, nobody wants to commit these kinds of crimes and get caught. So, meanwhile, the defendant misses a call from Isabella at 4:22 p.m. because she's too busy with her surveillance cameras while she's at the target. And you're going to hear 2 minutes later at 4:24, the defendant returns the call and speaks with Isabella so she can determine when she's coming home. Now, this is a very interesting video that you'll see during trial. This is just a screenshot. At 4:32, the defendant walks out of the target. You can see that she's looking at her phone. And on the video, you'll see that she is so focused on her phone for approximately 20-25 seconds as she walks towards the exit that she has to alter her path because she's almost walking away from where the exits are because she's so focused on her phone, intent on monitoring what's going on the surveillance cameras outside of her phone. And again, as I said, you're going to see that there are various records that show her conduct consistent with accessing the IDMS Lite app on her phone and viewing her home cameras remotely to ensure, again, that nobody comes home while Austin and Baker are jogging up to commit the crime. At 4:38, she pulls out of the Target parking lot, and at 4:42, again, continuing her plan to create an alibi for herself, she enters the local Ralph's Market. And you'll see that video. She exits about 10 minutes later. You can see once again, she's has her head down looking at her phone. At 4:46, when Baker should now be at the home, she's messaging Baker via Viber, the encrypted app. Baker and Austin, armed with knives, go out to the patio where they're told Fabio would be. You're going to hear Fabio's last call was at 4:27 p.m. His last use of the internet was at 4:39. He was, as Baker described, a big guy, about 5'10", 300 pounds. And you're going to hear that he was then stabbed to death. You're going to learn that Baker was previously in the Army, where he likely learned about critical target areas on the body, such as the heart, jugular vein, and femoral artery in the leg where Fabio was stabbed. After the murder, Austin goes to sit in the Porsche, and Baker stages the crime scene to look like some kind of a burglary or robbery to throw off law enforcement. But Baker isn't very smart, and he only ransacks the master bedroom. And the other mistake that he makes is that someone who had come to the home during the day to commit a burglary could have committed the burglary and gotten out without ever having contact with Fabio, because he's on the back patio, and they could have come in, taken what they wanted, and left. The fact that there was blood on various items in the master bedroom indicates that the murder took place first, and then the crime scene was staged as a burglary or a robbery to throw off law enforcement, which makes no sense. That was a significant piece of evidence for law enforcement, a clue that this was an inside job. In addition to that, you'll hear that the safe was still intact. No one had gotten into the safe. Fabio had a gun in the safe. That was not taken. And that there was no sign of a struggle anywhere throughout the house. And the only room that had any ransacking with blood that Baker transferred from the victim, from Fabio, to various items in this room was the master bedroom. It was the only room that was touched. So, of course, when LAPD come to the scene, they start to get the idea this is a staged burglary, given that the entire house, which is a very large house, only one room is ransacked, that being the master. No other rooms are touched, and Fabio's blood is found in the master bedroom because, as I said, the murder occurred first. Another dead giveaway. In a real robbery, the robbers would have surely taken the Rolex watch on Fabio's wrist, as you can see here, as he is lying in a puddle of his own blood. You're going to hear that Baker cut himself during the murder and was bleeding from a cut to his finger, which left behind forensic evidence. Baker's DNA was found throughout the crime scene. There was a stain on the empty vinegar bottle that you can see there left in the kitchen sink. Baker and Fabio's DNA was discovered on the bottle along with the defendant's genetic profile. You're going to hear about DNA testing and the DNA results in this case from LAPD's DNA analyst, Randy Zepeda. Also, obviously, you're going to hear that when Delia left the house was clean. There was not a bunch of items that had been ransacked in the master, and there certainly wasn't bloodstains throughout the house that you're going to see in this case, or empty vinegar bottles sitting in the sink. Before fleeing the crime scene with Austin, Baker turns off the circuit breaker box, cutting off power to the home. And so Why he did that, I can't tell you, but he had to manually open the garage door by pulling on the manual lever there in order to drive out in Fabio's Porsche. And his DNA, where you see that card, the placard, yellow placard that says 39, that's something that criminalists from the crime lab put where they collect bloodstains or other items of evidence to identify where they took them from. And his DNA is found on the garage door manual release. Another significant piece of evidence, Baker removes the DVR box, which included any surveillance video that would have existed. That means it was done by someone with knowledge of where the box was kept, because it certainly wasn't in plain sight in the house. It was on, as I said, top of this tall cabinet in the garage. And Baker obviously got that confidential information from the defendant regarding where the box was located, and that once he took the box, the surveillance system was not cloud-based, and therefore there would be no remaining video of what had happened. This is surveillance video showing Baker and Austin fleeing the crime scene in Fabio's Porsche. Baker took Fabio's keys from the kitchen, and at 4:53, he drives away in the Porsche. Again, since Baker was bleeding, he left behind his blood in the driver's compartment of Fabio's Porsche. He also tracked Fabio's blood. You can imagine this was a fairly bloody crime. It's a stabbing. Fabio was stabbed multiple times. You're going to hear about that from the chief medical examiner of LA County. And he tracked Fabio's blood into the Porsche, from his shoes and onto the clutch. As previously mentioned, you're going to hear about the DNA results from Randy Zepeda. So when I say a tight timeline, this is 4:53 as Baker and Austin are driving away. This is 4:54. This is Jessica returning to the house. So they nearly miss running into Isabella. Sorry, not Jessica. Isabella returning home. This is Isabella turning onto Queen Victoria just 1 minute after Baker and Austin left in Fabio's Porsche. After Isabella arrives home at 4:54, she finds her father's body on the back porch. You heard she calls 911 at 4:55 from the home phone, from a handset. The defendant, being the wonderful wife and mother that she is, she lets her 16-year-old daughter discover her father's bleeding body in order to distance herself from this murder. And she conveniently arrives a few minutes later at 5:03. Remember what time she left, Ralph's, and remember it took her only 3 minutes to get to the target. So she's waiting. They find Fabio slumped over, as you see here. Appears that he had stood up, perhaps to face his attackers. And once he is stabbed in the neck and in the thigh and the femoral vein, he goes down like a ton of bricks onto his favorite chair there. And the home phone handset is sitting on the chair that he had been using earlier when he was communicating with various people, showing that he was taken by surprise, and we'll talk about lying in wait and the elements of that at the end. It appears that the fire department arrives on scene pursuant to Isabella's 911 call at 5:06 p.m., and Fabio's pronounced dead in his own backyard at 5:09 p.m. So just a few minutes later, at 5:14 p.m., Baker contacts the defendant to let her know the job is done, again using Viber. This is, again, just a few minutes later at 5:14 p.m., Baker contacts the defendant to let her know that the job is done. This is their last Viber communication. They conveniently cease using the Viber app for communication, and they delete it from their phones. After this, they start using an entirely different encrypted application, WhatsApp, and we'll talk about that. From April of 2016 until the day of Fabio's murder, January 23rd of 2017, the defendant and Baker used Viber solely to communicate with each other. They didn't use it to communicate with others. So if there's an argument to be made that, oh, lots of people use Viber, they were only using it to talk to one another. As I said, after the murder, they switched to another communications encrypted app. And when they delete Viber, they also delete all associated data. But as I told you, remnants still remained on their mobile devices, at least the ones that we were able to recover that they didn't get rid of, proving they previously had these apps when their cell phones were forensically extracted and analyzed. And obviously, we were able to match that up with search warrants that we served on Viber for the actual records to figure out the dates and times. And you'll hear about that from various forensic experts, as well as stipulations agreements between the party in this case. So you're going to hear that Austin was initially scheduled to fly back the following day, January 24th of 2017. However, 45 minutes after the murder at 5:45, after fleeing the scene, Austin is now driving the rental vehicle, and he gets stopped by the LAPD for I think it's a seatbelt ticket. And you'll hear about that from Austin. And when Austin tells Baker about this, Baker says that he has to leave immediately and change his airline ticket. So Baker drives him to the bus depot for the Van Nuys flyaway. You're going to hear from geolocation expert Cy Ray that Austin's account is once again corroborated by Baker's cell site data that shows he was at the Van Nuys flyaway after the murder between 6:27 that night and 6:34 p.m. Baker tells Austin, because Austin is now freaking out at the flyaway at what he's done, Baker tells him again that the defendant wanted Fabio dead, so not to worry. And you'll hear that Austin took the flyaway shuttle to LAX. He went to the LAX Alaska Airlines ticket counter to change his flight, and he had to pay a fee to do that. And you'll see there's corroboration of that. And he flies home the same night as the murder. He also will tell you that Baker gave him several gold coins before he dropped them off at the flyaway shuttle, that he thought they were worth somewhere between $3,000 and $10,000 when he got back to Alaska. He traded them in for cash to buy various things, pay off some debt as well as his rent. And he believed that Baker got the gold coins from inside the Sementilli residence. Now, victim Fabio Sementilli's Porsche was not discovered until 2 days later on January 25th of 2017. It was discovered parked in a residential area 5 miles from the crime scene. What you're going to learn is that the LAPD was able to obtain surveillance video cameras that show the vehicle being dropped off at that location the same night as the murder at around 9:19 p.m. by someone who got out of the driver's seat and then just walked away and dumped the car. After Austin returned home to Anchorage, Alaska, Baker tells him to get a passport because they're going to Europe or Mexico to live once the defendant's money came in. Baker tells Austin when everything is settled that he's going to send for him. Austin believes this to be true. And Baker said, again, this would happen when the defendant got the life insurance money, the settlement. When Austin gets back to Alaska, he gets a burner phone at Baker's direction with money Baker gave him, and he communicates with a new number that Baker gives him. Baker also gets a burner phone, and they use WhatsApp to communicate. As I said, it's another encrypted app. Subsequently, Austin dumps the burner phone when he hears Baker had been arrested, and he goes on about his life and tries to pretend this never happened. On January 17th of 2025, just a couple weeks ago, Austin came into this courtroom. He pled guilty to second-degree murder and admitted the personal use of a knife. You will hear that he is set to be sentenced in this court to 15 years to life for second-degree murder, plus 1 for the use of the knife. And that is in exchange for his truthful testimony at trial as part of his plea agreement. You'll hear about the transcript. He was ordered that he is required to tell the truth, not some version that we tell him to say or his attorney tells him to say, and that at the end of the day, whether or not he is truthful is going to be up to Judge Cohen to decide, not up to the DA's office.
All right.
Thank you. So, again, a condition of his plea agreement, and there is also going to be a written document that you'll see that his lawyer signs, he signs, the district attorney signs, says all of these things that I'm telling you, and that ultimately, if he were to get up on the stand and let's say lie and come up with some story that the court determined to be untruthful, we could then ask to be relieved of this plea bargain, and then he would go to trial for first-degree murder, conspiracy, use of a knife. And you'll hear, again, that is up to the court, not the district attorney's office. You're going to hear that the defendant made several calls the night of the murder regarding the victim's murder to his family. You're going to hear that during these conversations, starting that night, she starts bringing up the victim's life insurance policy. You're going to hear she called Fabio's family in Toronto, including his son Luigi, who's going to come to testify. She told him through a friend, Deborah Obad, who was at the house at the time that she was making the calls, that he didn't have to worry because Fabio had a hefty life insurance policy and he would be taken care of. You're also going to hear that Fabio had a significant life insurance policy, as I mentioned also stock options and other assets, and that the defendant was one of the main beneficiaries to these policies and assets. Executives from Fabio's company, Wella, found out about the murder, came to see the defendant that night after learning of Fabio's murder, and the defendant began immediately to question them about Fabio's insurance policy and issues relating to money. You're going to hear that she began harassing and pestering multiple people about Fabio's insurance policy proceeds, and that it began that night, went on over the days, weeks, and months that followed until the date of her eventual arrest. Because the LAPD never cleared her, MetLife, who were the life insurance policy holder, refused to pay out defendant's portion of the insurance policy proceeds. They paid out the portions to the children, but as you are going to hear, it didn't really matter how many people she harassed, pestered, or even threatened. That at the end of the day, in a case like this where it's obvious someone is murdered, life insurance companies do not pay out until law enforcement tells them that the beneficiaries have been cleared. And the defendant was never cleared because the LAPD, at this point in time, it was Valley Bureau homicide detectives, Verna and Parshall, and you'll hear from Detective Verna, based on their investigation, did not clear her. So I'm going to turn to this part of the case now. As I said, the defendant became fixated with the life insurance payout beginning the night of the murder of her husband. She started conversations with Wella executives, Sal Macheri, the CEO, who's going to fly in and testify, Dave Diaz, another one of the vice presidents of the company. I think Bob Lucian was there that night, and Henry Meyer, who was the senior HR director, who would have been responsible for assisting the Sementilli family with whatever policies Fabio had through the company. You're going to hear that the executives agreed to pay the defendant Fabio's salary for 6 months. They came up with that policy just because of how important the Sementillis and Fabio was to the company. And so they told her not to worry about it. They were going to pay her for 6 months. And you're going to hear she asked about that again the next day. You're going to hear that unlike some companies, Wella not only paid for Fabio's salary for 6 months, they paid for a memorial. They paid for a wake that was held in the Sementilli backyard that was catered. They also paid to expatriate or transport his body back home to Canada for burial. You're going to hear about the defendant's pressure campaign to try and speed up the life insurance payouts from multiple witnesses, including Henry Meyer, including Janet Cover, who worked for HR with Henry, and Tracy Rakovich, who was the senior benefits manager for Cody Incorporated, which also included Wella out of their New York office. You're going to hear that the defendant complained on a regular basis to Detective Parshall, Detective Verna, and their partner, Detective Steve Castro, about why law enforcement was taking so long in their investigation to come up with a suspect and to clear her. You're going to hear that she complained to all of Fabio's colleagues and friends and to anyone who would listen that she had no money and was desperately in need of Fabio's life insurance proceeds in order.
Again, you need to stand up and stretch. Stand up and stretch. You're part of the family now. You know? All right, so, that in mind, you may continue.
So as you can see here from this text message string, the defendant's friend, Deborah Obad, began messaging the CEO, Sal Macheri, the night of the murder at about 11:30 and throughout the next day multiple times, stating that the defendant wants to know about the insurance money. You're going to hear from Sal Macheri that he thought that at this particular time that wasn't anybody's main concern, given that Fabio had just been brutally murdered at his home. He explained to Deborah Obad that Henry Meyer, the director of HR, was the person to contact. He's, again, the CEO. You're going to hear that he showed these text messages to Dave Diaz and Henry Meyer because he found them so inappropriate and given the timing. But again, this was the beginning, and you can see here on the left, Deborah Obad is texting Sal Macheri that Monica is asking about the life insurance. Can you figure this out? You're going to hear more about the defendant's close friend, Deborah Obad, later, and the part that she played in some of the investigation. You're also going to hear, as I said, from several of Fabio's colleagues at Wella and in various capacities, and at a trendsetter trip. I told you about the trendsetter trip that they got to go on every year because of their successes for the company. 2 years prior to the murder, maybe a little less, maybe about a year and a half, the defendant told the regional education manager that Fabio was worth more dead to her than alive. And needless to say, this was something Mr. Pulera never forgot, and you will hear from him when he flies out. So, You're going to hear that the defendant stands to inherit over $2 million in this case, $2.2 million, if she's acquitted of the charges, if she's acquitted of Fabio's murder. You're going to hear from an expert in family law and marital dissolution, Marie Ebersbacher. She's an independent expert that the district attorney's office hired that will talk to you about the various assets. We'll talk about the total amount of inheritance at issue here, just the defendant's portion, $2.2 million, including life insurance and other assets. And because she's also an expert a forensic expert in family law and marital dissolution, she's going to also testify that this amount is $1.5 million more than the defendant would have gotten had she divorced Fabio. So what the defendant said to Sam Culera back in 2015, that Fabio was worth more dead than alive, she certainly knew what she was talking about. You're going to hear that the defendant was interviewed, as you can imagine, by law enforcement multiple times, by the LAPD. And you could also imagine that someone who had their spouse murdered would be willing to talk to law enforcement and provide every scintilla of information they could to make sure that the person that they were married to for almost 20 years, who they claimed to have loved, who they shared a home with for almost 20 years, who they had children with, would be nothing if not completely truthful and cooperative with law enforcement, because you could imagine that your main focus would be to assist law enforcement so that they can apprehend somebody who brutally murdered your spouse at your home. That's not what happened here. You're going to hear that the defendant lied over and over and over again to law enforcement. As I told you, initially this case was being handled by the Valley Bureau Homicide Division, Detectives Ryan Verna and Jean Parshall and their unit. And when they interviewed her, she claimed she didn't even think Fabio had life insurance or know anything about the policy. And this was something that she said on the night of the murder when she was first interviewed. But in reality, what you're going to see is that she knew all about Fabio's life insurance policy. I already told you she was the one that handled the family finances. But what you see here is an email that Fabio sent to the defendant with his 2017 benefit and life insurance policy selections. And this occurred on October 4th of 2016. He specifically sent the defendant an email with screenshots of those benefit elections and his life insurance policy, indicating 2 times his salary. And you can imagine this is just a piece of the email, but you can see it comes from Fabio. Well has now been bought out by Cody, and he sends it to the defendant. Actually, it should say Monica Sementilli at the top, and it's her email, calmatimo@hotmail.com. Henry Meyer, the HR director at Cody, gave the defendant several documents. These are a couple of them that you see here, showing Fabio's estimated disbursements for his beneficiaries, because Fabio made elections as to how much he wanted to go to each child and how much he wanted to go to Monica. And the documentation that Henry Meyer provided didn't even contain all of the life insurance and other benefits that Fabio had signed up with. You're also going to hear from Janet Cover, who worked under Henry Meyer in the HR division at Cody, that the defendant requested that she come to the Sementilli home and make calls with her. And you're going to hear that Janet Cover went to the Sementilli home, made various calls at the defendant's request to the insurance companies, and that occurred in February of 2017. Remember, Fabio's murdered January 23rd. Throughout the next several months, the defendant claimed that she urgently needed money, although, again, as you'll hear, she was still getting Fabio's salary. She called HR at Wella every couple of days regarding this urgency that she needed for money. And she also expressed this urgency to the LAPD. You're going to hear at some point, although Henry Meyer was the one who put into policy for Wella and Cody going forward, when an employee of the company dies in this manner, that the company's going to pay them salary for 6 months, which is also something that would be unheard of. That was something Henry Meyer came up with and pushed through as policy with Salma Cherry. And you're going to hear that the defendant complained about him, that he wasn't trying to speed up the payment quick enough, and so she eventually had a lawyer start calling him about the money. And as I told you before, Henry Meyer, this wasn't something he could do anything about. On February 14th of 2017, the defendant received a response from P&G regarding a breakdown showing that Fabio had approximately $230,000 just in stock options. And this was found in her email account. The defendant sent portions of this chart that you see here to Luigi, Fabio's son. And when Luigi flew into town with the rest of the family, she printed out a copy on her computer, which was in the upstairs office area in the house, immediately after his father's murder, showing him the breakdown of Fabio's life insurance and other benefits and the portion that would be coming to him. As I mentioned, the defendant called the LAPD homicide detectives, Verna and Parshall, the initial investigating officers on this case, repeatedly on each of these dates, trying to get information to stay ahead of their investigation, to throw them off track, to keep her co-conspirator, Robert Baker, informed of their progress. And she constantly asked about whether they had any DNA results. You're going to hear that detectives, because they were investigating her and knew about her relationship with Baker, when every time she would call, they would record the conversation. So you don't have to take my word for it. All of these were recorded, and you will hear those conversations and those calls that she made to the LAPD on each of these dates, including all of the things I just mentioned. And that despite the fact that they were in the middle of an investigation, homicide detectives aren't going to give up the information in their investigation. That's not what they're trained to do. They're not going to do anything that potentially could hamper or impede their investigation. On March 9th, the defendant called P&G and a Canadian insurance company, Morneau Chappelle, to try and acquire Fabio's life insurance. She expressed her frustration with them, claimed she didn't know what was going on, although you'll hear that she was advised of the process by LAPD numerous times and the HR department at Cody. She said she needed to speak with someone immediately, and you're going to hear that this was another recorded call that we received via subpoena from the insurance company. On May 19th of 2017, the defendant emailed a realtor, Bernard Preisman, regarding listing the Sementilli home for sale. The home sold for $1.3 million. You're going to hear that the defendant received $169,000 from the sale of the home after their loan was paid off. So she got half. The other half was put into Fabio's estate because Fabio died without a will. And if she's acquitted here, she will get, on top of that, the other $169,000. And you'll hear about that as well from our financial experts. As I mentioned from the very first interview, on the night of her husband's murder, the defendant lied to law enforcement. You're going to hear that detectives Ryan Verna, who's been retired now for several years, his partner Jean Parchal, who's now deceased, handled this investigation. You're going to hear about the defendant's statements, her conduct from Detective Verna, who's going to fly in and testify. You're going to hear that these detectives repeatedly asked her about whether she had remote access to her home surveillance cameras. She denied ever knowing about remote access as well as ever doing so. And remember, this is someone who, as I said, is supposed to be trying to assist law enforcement to find the killers of her beloved husband. But what she says and does is the complete opposite. And so you will hear through their testimony that she tries over and over to throw law enforcement off the trail that leads to her lover and herself. You're also going to hear that immediately after the murder, the defendant did exactly what I mentioned this morning. She starts to play the victim. She plays the grieving widow. You're going to hear that she did this with multiple witnesses, with friends, with family, and with Fabio's colleagues. You're going to hear that she lied and misled investigators about key issues in this case. She mentioned when they asked her what she had done on the day of the murder, that she had gone to LA Fitness and Target, but she certainly didn't mention that she ever saw Baker at or even ran into him at either of these locations. She never mentioned that she had been in constant communication with Baker throughout the entire day of January 23rd, and you're going to hear about that from the Viber records. She claimed she didn't even know what kind of camera system they had, even though she was the one who communicated with Sean Kahn and was there for the installation. She told them that she didn't have access to the home surveillance cameras on her phone, and you'll learn that that was a lie. She said Fabio didn't have life insurance. Then she claimed she wasn't sure if he did. And then she said she only knew he had a life insurance policy in Canada for her stepson, Luigi, and that was despite the documentation that I've shown you. Now, an autopsy was conducted on Fabio Sementilli in this case by the LA County Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Ukbo, on January 26th of 2017. The cause of death, obviously, was multiple stab wounds. Dr. Ukbo is going to testify about the fatal stab wounds that Fabio suffered. There were 7 sharp force injuries, including sharp force injuries to his neck area. You can see he was stabbed in the neck multiple times. These injuries to his neck perforated his right jugular vein as well as his right carotid artery. He was bleeding into his trachea and aspirating blood into his lung. What that means is that he was choking on his own blood for several minutes while he was alive before he eventually succumbed to his injuries. One of the stab wounds to Fabio's left chest pierced his heart, as you can see in the picture to the top right. He also suffered, as I mentioned earlier, a stab wound to his right thigh, which perforated his right femoral artery and vein. That is in the bottom right photograph. He did not sustain any defensive wounds. That means any wounds to his hands or wrists or forearm areas, which means that, which someone would normally do to ward off an attacker, which means a few different things. It's consistent with the fact that he was overwhelmed by 2 assailants wielding knives. that he was taken by surprise and that this was a crime that was committed while lying in wait. You're going to hear that the sharp force injuries in this case are consistent with a knife or knives, but Dr. Ukpo is unable to tell how many actual implements were used. Now, after the murder, as I told you, the defendant set about to play the grieving widow. You can see she set up a shrine here in Fabio's favorite chair on the patio where he liked to sit and smoke cigars. And on January 25th at 10:30 in the morning, the defendant posted this picture to her Instagram account with the caption, "This is your spot. This is where you belong forever. I will always keep the fire on for you, waiting." This is the same location where he was stabbed to death 2 days before by her lover. You're going to hear that on Sunday, January 29th, there was a viewing at a funeral home in Canoga Park in Woodland Hills, followed by a wake at the Sementilli home for family members and close friends. As I mentioned, that was catered by Wella. You can see here the defendant sitting at the wake with the shrine next to her on Fabio's chair. This was, as you can imagine, a solemn occasion for family and friends to gather and mourn Fabio and also celebrate his life. However, there was one person present who didn't belong, who seemed out of place to family and to friends. You can see here that person circled in the line to get food and drinks. That one person, just a few feet away from where Fabio was gruesomely murdered the week prior. And that person was one of the actual killers. That person was Robert Baker. And you can see him seated here, basically in the same area where he had murdered Fabio, next to Monica, on the patio, next to the fire pit, mere feet from where he had murdered Fabio Sementilli. So you need to ask yourselves at this point, how does Baker end up here? How does Baker wind up getting invited to this? He wasn't a friend of Fabio. He wasn't a friend of the family. He wasn't a family member. He was there at the invitation of the defendant. That shows you, along with other evidence in this case, how arrogant this defendant is, how confident she was in her ability to fool and manipulate people so that she wouldn't get caught, because she saw Baker as her soulmate. And as I said, this wasn't just an affair. This was an entirely separate life that she had secretly created and planned to continue. If you look closely at the photograph here of Baker at the wake for Fabio, you can see he covered the cut to his finger from the brutal knife attack on Fabio with a Band-Aid. And that Band-Aid on Robert Baker's finger was observed by multiple people, including the defendant's friend Deborah Obad, who sent these pictures of Baker at the wake to LAPD, to Detectives Parshall and Berna, because she knew there was something very, very wrong. And you're going to hear that Baker gave conflicting statements, because I told you, as big of a liar as this defendant is, Baker is her match. He gave multiple conflicting statements on how he sustained this injury, and you'll hear about that. Now I want to show you the evidence of the defendant's alternate life after her husband's murder, which she was keeping secret from her family and friends. You're going to learn, as I told you, that she's the master of deception, and you have photographic evidence to prove it. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. I don't have to stand up here for 2 days, although it sounds like at this point I will be. But you're going to have an enormous amount of photographic evidence that's going to show you this. She presented herself as a grieving wife and mom, but as you can see here, it was all an act. These are photographs that were taken, the first one on March 18th, 2017, and the other one on the right in Las Vegas on May 5th of 2017. The evidence is going to show that she prided herself on being this great actress, that she was a very convincing liar, but she's also a chameleon. She can change who she appears to be, and that she fooled so many people who thought that they knew her and still believe that they know her. But all you have to do is look at the photographic evidence and the dichotomy between what she was posting publicly on her social media pictures and what was going on behind the scenes in photographs she never thought anybody would see. And you're going to hear about this from some of family belonging to Fabio, including Fabio's sister Morella, who loved the defendant, loved Monica like a sister. And you're going to see the defendant is somebody who is used to using others to do her bidding, including Fabio, Baker, and Austin, because she wanted to live that high life that Fabio provided till it no longer fulfilled her. And she spent, as you'll see, in some of the photographs I'm going to show you this afternoon before we wrap up until next week, considerable effort building a false perception of who she was. You're going to see evidence of that dichotomy, the reality of who she really was, proven by the photos, by witness accounts, by patterns of communication, and some of this is going to come in the form of evidence from the defendant's Instagram account, her iCloud account, Baker's Dropbox, his SD cards, and analysis of all of the cell phones that were recovered after their arrest. After the murder, you're going to learn that she behaved as if there was no danger, as if her husband hadn't just been brutally murdered at her home, and that she was totally free and single without grieving traumatized children at home. And you're going to hear she began going out with Baker after Fabio's murder, as you can see here. And these are pictures, if you talk about February 8th, which you're going to see 2 weeks after Fabio's murder. You're going to hear that see some of the exchanges between her and her daughters on what she was doing after the murder. An innocent person whose husband was just viciously killed in their own backyard would literally move out immediately, probably, or at least take extreme safety precautions. Instead,
His argument. Opening statement, please.
What you're going to hear is that the defendant told people she was unafraid, and that was because she knew who the killer was. As a result, you're going to hear she told detectives she didn't replace the stolen DVR system or take other safety measures when she was asked by law enforcement. And most importantly, you're going to hear she left her kids alone while she went out with Baker night after night, staying with him into the early morning hours on several occasions. You're also going to hear that she began traveling with Baker as a couple. And the only reasonable explanation is that she was not afraid to leave her kids home alone in the house where their father was murdered because she knew who the killer was, and therefore knew that he presented no danger to her daughters. For example, during Fabio's interment in Toronto, when his remains were being buried, you're going to hear that the defendant took naked selfies of herself and sent them to Fabio. This occurred at the same time that she was pretending to be the great grieving widow. In reality, you're going to hear that she was involved not only with Baker, but swinging with third parties. You're also going to hear that she started using an alternate name, Madonna. This gives you an idea of communications, the Viber communications and the messaging between the defendant and Baker to each other through their cell phones 5,752 times in January 2017 alone using Viber. The yellow peaks that you see are Baker. The red peaks that you see are the defendant. The timeline here shows you the usage of encrypted apps. We talked about Viber. We talked about the fact they switched to WhatsApp after the murder by the defendant and Baker using their mobile devices and accounts. This is based on evidence from multiple sources, as you're going to hear. As I mentioned, the iCloud records, subpoenas that brought in AT&T records and web history, Viber and WhatsApp business records, forensic extractions of cell phones, and stipulations. You're going to hear that the defendant installed Viber on her phone on April 9th of 2016 and deleted it sometime before her arrest on June 14th of 2017. You'll hear that she installed WhatsApp, the second encrypted application, on January 27th, 5 days after her husband's murder. You'll also hear that Baker installed WhatsApp on the day of the murder at about 11:40 p.m. You're going to see that WhatsApp business records for Baker's cell phone show both Chris Austin's cell phone and the defendant's cell phone as symmetric contacts, meaning that the contacts for Baker's cell phone number existed in both Austin and the defendant's respective WhatsApp accounts. You're also going to hear that the contacts for Baker and the defendant's cell numbers existed in each other's respective WhatsApp contacts as well, and that will be explained to you by Officer Curtis Davis. Basically, the business records show a connection between the defendant and Baker and between Baker and Austin. And you'll also learn that a burner phone is a phone that's not registered to anyone. Therefore, it cannot be tracked. It's essentially a cheap throwaway phone. You pay for it with cash. It can't be traced to a particular subscriber like your regular cell phone can be, and that it's typically used by criminals. WhatsApp business record for Baker's cell phone number show a new Samsung, an S6 Android device that was registered the day of the murder at 11:40 p.m. This phone was never recovered, whether it was during search warrants at his apartment, his vehicle, or at the defendant's home or vehicle. This was a phone he got rid of. You're also going to hear the defendant and Baker discuss getting rid of their burner phones and his computer in recordings that occurred back here in the courthouse lockup. WhatsApp business records for the defendant's cell phone show the first iPhone device registration on January 27th, 2017 at 8:34 in the morning. And as I said, after the murder, they switched from using Viber to WhatsApp. On 1/26 of 2017, corroborating what Austin told us, Baker tells Austin to download WhatsApp on your phone from his Facebook messages. You'll hear Austin purchased a burner at Baker's direction with money Baker gave him, so he and Baker could continue to communicate after the murder. You're going to hear that Austin then began communicating with Baker on Baker's new burner phone, which was a different number, a phone that, again, was never recovered, and that Austin also disposed of his burner phone. On January 31st through February 8th of 2017, the defendant, along with her daughters, traveled to Toronto to repatriate Fabio's body to his home country. On February 8th, it would have been their 20th wedding anniversary. February 28th, 2017, was a one-month mass that took place again in Toronto. This is a picture taken on February 4th of 2017 of the defendant along with Fabio's children in a vehicle in Toronto heading to a funeral event. You're going to hear that on this same day, she sent multiple selfies of herself nude to Baker. Defendant took and sent Baker multiple nude selfies each day, in fact, while she was in Toronto for Fabio's services. On February 2nd and 3rd, those were days that they had a viewing of the body. The defendant sent nude pictures of herself at 12:25 in the afternoon, 12:27 in the afternoon, 12:40 in the afternoon, and you're going to hear that these photographs weren't just nude selfies, they were close-up photographs of her vagina, of her buttocks. On February 4th was the funeral, the mass, and the cremation for Fabio. The defendant again sent multiple nude selfies to Baker at 6:34 p.m., a picture of herself masturbating. At 10:43 p.m., a close-up picture of her breasts. At 10:53 p.m., another picture of her vagina. On February 5th, the defendant sent Baker again multiple nude selfies at 12:33 p.m., and again at 12:36 p.m., and again at 10:09 p.m. On February 7th, the defendant again sent multiple nude pictures to Baker, again, pictures of her vagina, and these are photographs, as I've told you, that will be described for you. All of these pictures were found on Baker's SD card, item 157, meaning that he received them from the defendant. At the same time that she was doing this secretly, this is what she was doing publicly. On February 8th at 3:01, the defendant posted a series of photos on Instagram of herself and Fabio with this caption, celebrating their 20th anniversary. And you can read for her the rest of it for yourself. The defendant arrived home from Toronto on February 8th, her anniversary, and immediately went out that night with Baker. Instead of worrying about her two young daughters left at home in the same location where their father had been murdered, she texts Jessica, her daughter, and she basically tells Jessica to lie for her. And if anybody calls, to say she's asleep, because she doesn't want anybody to know she's out with Baker. And you can see here that exchange. And she says in her text, under no circumstances, answer the phone. Or if anyone texts asking if we're okay, you say I'm asleep. Okay? Nobody. Got it? And then she goes out with Baker. And the text continue that night. Jessica says, okay, love you, be smart. Later that night, the night of her anniversary, Isabella, the younger daughter, sends a text to her mother and to her sister saying, what the hell? Why are you leaving me alone for so long? I don't want to be alone in this house. This is at 10:27 p.m. Receiving no response, about 10 minutes later, she says, all right, well, don't forget I exist or anything. And that's the communication at 10:38. And it goes on. Now Monica, the defendant, is texting Jessica, where are you? Get home. And Jessica says, I'm just getting off the freeway right now. So at 10:44, the girls are home alone, but their mother's out with her lover, the man who she planned the murder of their father with. Early in the morning, now February 9th, the defendant texts to Jessica that she's on her way home at 12:38 a.m. and finally returns home as if her husband never existed at all. On February 14th, LAPD detectives obtained some initial DNA results matching Baker from evidence that was collected at the crime scene and from Fabio's Porsche. You're going to hear from a LAPD criminalist who now works for the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation as a criminalist regarding this diagram, Corey Hawk, which depicts the location of various bloodstains at the home. She's the person who processed the crime scene and collected evidence samples, and she was, as I said, working for LAPD's crime lab back in 2017. You'll hear that Baker was dripping blood, which he left behind in various parts of the house, including the entry area, the kitchen area, the master bedroom, which he ransacked, and the garage. Not surprisingly, as I also mentioned, Baker also transferred the victim's blood throughout the house, into the kitchen, onto the counter, the entryway floor, and you'll hear about that regarding the DNA results from Randy Zapata. You're going to hear that all of these crime scene samples match to Baker, that his DNA was found on the kitchen floor in a couple different locations, the entry area as well as in the garage floor. And once those DNA results came back in February, of course, law enforcement did not tell the defendant about the results pointing to Baker because they knew at this point about the affair. After it was located 2 days later, Fabio's Porsche was impounded and examined by another LAPD criminalist, Jane Kwan, from the crime lab. You're going to hear that she collected bloodstains from the Porsche in the driver's compartment, which were submitted for DNA analysis. The DNA analysis resulted in matches to Baker. His blood was on the driver's door panel, the driver's seat controls, and the steering wheel. And as he walked through Fabio's blood on the patio, he tracked Fabio's blood onto the clutch, what they, I think, initially labeled as a brake pedal, because Baker had Fabio's blood on the bottom of his shoes as he drove Fabio's Porsche away from the crime scene. This is February 16th. Again, the defendant publicly posting photos of Fabio with a caption that he's the love of her life, outwardly displaying that she's a grieving widow. And you'll see that she continuously posted, you won't see the photos, but her statements, the captions about her anguish and heartbreak over the loss of her husband, in order to provide a cover for her participation in the murder so that no one would suspect her. This was an Instagram post, again, from February 18th. Greatest man on earth. And we know how she's secretly spending her time. LAPD detectives, Verna and Parshall, decided that they were going to begin to conduct surveillance on the defendant in February of 2017, and you'll hear that a special unit in LAPD referred to as the Gangs and Narcotics Division, a surveillance unit, handled the surveillance between February 19th and March 3rd of 2017. You're going to hear that during that time they observed Baker with 3 cell phones on him at the same time. You're also going to hear that detectives Verna and Parshall obtained search warrants for phone pings and vehicle trackers. That meant that through the search warrants signed by judges, they were able to track the defendant and Baker's cell phones, and once they put trackers on their vehicles, they could track their whereabouts, and you're going to hear that assisted them with the surveillance that went on, and they followed the defendant going out several nights a week with Baker during this time period when the defendant and Baker went to Hollywood bars and partied all night into the early morning hours. On February 16th, G&D installed vehicle trackers on the defendant's Ford F-150 pursuant to a warrant so that they could follow the defendant wherever she went, and you'll hear about that from Detective Ryan Verna. This is an Instagram post from February 18th at 8:44 p.m. where she's posting again a photo of herself with Fabio with this caption, and at the end you'll see she tags "love of my life." Pay attention to that. You're going to see that again. In jail letters, you're going to see that the defendant used LOML in her letters to Baker, claiming that actually Baker was the love of her life. And again, more text messages. This is February 19th. The defendant goes out with Baker, and she texts Jessica the same thing. Don't answer. Just say you're hanging out. And she's going out with Baker that night. You're going to hear that after the murder for about a week or so in February, Baker stayed at this address, 331 Salem in Glendale, an apartment belonging to his friend Roger Brown. You're going to hear that the defendant would come here, drive to Glendale to pick up Baker often for their date night, and that Roger Brown knows the defendant by the name Madonna. That was how he was introduced to her. Brown provided one of Baker's burner phone numbers to law enforcement when he was interviewed in June of 2017, which they previously did not know about. So you're going to hear from Roger Brown that the defendant, who he knew as Madonna, was going out with Baker and staying over into the early morning hours on a regular basis at the apartment while Baker was living there for a period of time. On February 19th at 1:38 in the afternoon, GPS trackers on the defendant's Ford F-150 tracked her and Baker to this location on Melrose, 7250 Melrose. This is the parlor bar on Melrose, which you're going to hear about. On February 20th, again, text between the defendant and Jessica at after midnight. The defendant's out with Baker, again, leaving her daughter's home alone while she's partying with Baker. She returns this night at 2:20 in the morning. On February 21st of 2017, the defendants again interviewed by LAPD detectives Ryan Verna and Jean Parshall. Again, it's a recorded interview, which you'll hear about. And you're going to hear once again, she lies to them about various things, including her remote access to the home surveillance system. She tells them she had not replaced the DVR security system, although she and the girls are living in the home. She claims she couldn't find any paperwork for the DVR that was stolen. She tells the detectives that Fabio probably paid the installers in cash because he always walked around with a lot of cash in his pockets and paid everybody in cash. And she also said that someone unknown came to the home to install the DVR system, but she has no information as to who the installer was or the company, but she's going to go back and check their credit card receipts just in case. She purposely never mentioned to them that the person who was actually home for that installation was her, not Fabio, that she intentionally never mentioned that she had remote access to the cameras through an app she downloaded onto her phone. She also failed to mention that she was in communication with Baker, as I mentioned, on the day Fabio was killed, or her meetups with him at LA Fitness or Target when they went through, once again, the details of her day. When asked if anyone had cut themselves and possibly left blood in the house, she said that Fabio may have cut himself trying to fix this power washer. When asked about stolen property or any missing items, she claimed that cash was missing that Fabio kept for travel, some inexpensive jewelry, and Fabio's gold coins, which you heard about from Austin. She tells law enforcement multiple lies regarding Baker. You can see here a transcript, and you'll hear about this audio of this interview along with the transcript, where she underplays her relationship with Baker, pretending she doesn't even know his last name. She tells them Baker's never been to her house before the murder, that she certainly never mentioned to them that he spent the night when Fabio was out of town. However, what you're going to learn is that during this particular date of February 21st, these detectives speak with Jessica privately, and Jessica mentions finding Baker in her mother's bed on a certain morning when Fabio was out of town. The map that you see on the bottom right shows how often Baker was present at or near the Sementilli home from January 1st, 2016 to January 1st of 2017. You can see all those blue dots. Okay, I'll do a couple more. As I mentioned, a surveillance unit, the Gangs and Narcotics Division, was following the defendant and Baker at the time. This is February 21st at 8:50 p.m. They followed her again to the Parlor Bar on Melrose. You can see the defendant and Baker are sitting at a table having drinks. And when they went outside, photographs were taken again by the surveillance division of the defendant and Baker kissing at the valet booth while they're waiting for their vehicle. You're going to hear about that from Detectives Andy Cheng and Joe Anaya. One last slide. Next, on the night of February 21st, after the Parlor Bar, Detectives Cheng and Anaya follow the defendant and Baker to a place called the Dime Bar on Fairfax Avenue. They watched as the defendant came out front of the location alone for a period of time, where she was smoking, and she began talking, you're going to hear, to the male bouncer at this location, that she began rubbing the bouncer's inner thigh, that she grabbed the bouncer by the back of the neck and began kissing him. And you're going to hear again about these observations from these detectives who followed the defendant and what happened after that. As I mentioned, today I was going to speak all day, and it looks like I will be speaking for a good portion of the day on Tuesday when you return. Again, keep in mind that what I am showing you is the wealth of evidence that the defendant created that's going to be presented to you through various witnesses in this case over the course of the next several weeks. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. As I stated, we will not be in session on Monday. We will next be in session Tuesday at 9 a.m. A couple things I need to tell you first, as always, is the admonition. You not discuss this case either among yourselves or with anyone else, or to form or express any opinion to the cause that's finally submitted to you. So you're members of the 101 family. What does that mean? Well, tonight's pizza night. That's what it means. Have a good weekend. Have a good Monday. I'll see you Tuesday.